It started with something small, something so minor that at first I barely even registered it. My keychain. I've had the same one for years. A cheap metal charm shaped like a tiny compass, worn smooth from time and use. One morning, as I grabbed my keys before heading out, I noticed the charm was different. The compass was gone, replaced by a small, silver coin with unfamiliar markings. I frowned, turning it over in my palm, trying to remember if I had swapped it out at some point. But I knew I hadn't. It was the same keyring, the same set of keys, but something had changed. Something had been changed. I shrugged it off. Maybe I had lost the charm without realizing it and replaced it absent-mindedly. Maybe I had simply forgotten. But then the next thing happened. That afternoon, I stopped at my usual coffee shop, a place I'd been going to for years. The barista, Jake, knew my order by heart. A medium vanilla latte, no sugar. I walked in, gave him my usual nod, and waited as he started making it. When he handed me the cup, I hesitated. My name was written wrong on the side. Eric. My name is Evan. I laughed, holding up the cup. Hey man, messing with me today? Jake gave me a blank look. What do you mean? You wrote Eric on here, I said, shaking my head. Never seen you get it wrong before. His expression didn't change. That's your name, isn't it? A cold ripple ran through me. No, it's not. It's Evan. He frowned slightly, like he was trying to process what I had just said. Ah, I could have sworn it was Eric. Sorry, dude. I stared at him. The way he said it, flat, uninterested, felt wrong, like he didn't actually believe he had made a mistake. Like he wasn't really sorry at all. I didn't finish the coffee. That night, I was scrolling through my phone when I noticed something else. Old photos had changed. I don't mean the filters or the framing. I mean the photos themselves. A picture from my sister's wedding, one I had looked at dozens of times, was different. In the original, I was standing between my sister and my mom, both of them smiling, my sister's arm wrapped around my shoulder. But now, my mom was gone. The space where she had stood was empty, as if she had never been in the picture at all. I checked my computer, digging through old backups. Every single version was the same. I called my sister. Hey, random question, I said, forcing my voice to sound casual. That wedding picture, the one of the three of us. You still have it, right? There was a pause. Then, there were only two of us in that picture, Evan. The way she said it made my skin crawl. Not confused, not questioning. Certain. I didn't sleep that night. The next few days, more things changed. The street sign at the end of my block had different lettering. My neighbor's car, which I knew for a fact had always been red, was now a dull blue. My favorite jacket, one I had worn for years, had a different zipper. An old brass pull instead of the black plastic one I had fidgeted with countless times. Each time, I tried to convince myself I was misremembering, that I was making something out of nothing. But how many noting things did it take before I couldn't explain it away? Then it started happening with people. I ran into an old friend, Mark, at a diner downtown. We hadn't seen each other in a while, but I recognized him immediately. Mark, hey, I said, walking up to his table. He looked up, blinking at me in confusion. Sorry, do I know you? I gave him a short laugh, waiting for the joke. Dude, it's Evan. From college? We were roommates for 2 years. His expression didn't change. I think you have the wrong person. I stared at him, feeling the blood drain from my face. Mark, come on, man. He shook his head, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. I don't know you. I stood there for a long moment, my mouth dry, my heart hammering. He wasn't joking. There was no flicker of recognition, no hidden smile. He was serious. I left without finishing my meal. The worst part? The next day, when I went through my phone, I couldn't find a single picture of Mark. No texts, no emails, nothing. As if he had never existed at all. It was at that point I stopped talking to people about it. No one else seemed to notice. No one else seemed to care. Every time I brought up one of the changes, I was met with the same reaction. Confusion, polite dismissal, or that same unnerving certainty that things had always been that way. I started keeping a list. Every single thing that changed, I wrote down, hoping to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. But the more I wrote, the more I realized the list was growing too fast. One morning, I stepped outside to find that my entire apartment building looked different. Not just repainted, structurally different. The door was on the wrong side, the windows were the wrong shape, and when I looked at the buzzer system, my apartment number was missing. I hesitated before going inside, my hands shaking. When I unlocked my door, I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but everything looked the same, down to the books stacked by my bedside. That was when I knew for sure it was only happening to me. No one else saw it. No one else felt it. I was alone in this shifting, unraveling version of my own life. I don't know how much longer I can take this. Every day, something changes. People I knew disappear. Old memories alter. Places I've been 100 times become foreign. I don't know if I'm slipping into a different reality piece by piece, or if something is rewriting the world around me while I'm still awake to witness it. All I know is that I'm running out of things to hold on to, and I'm terrified that one day, I'll wake up and there will be nothing left that's real. It started on an ordinary morning. I woke up to the sound of my alarm, brewed my coffee, and went about my usual routine, confident that nothing was amiss. I left my apartment, walked to the bus stop, and boarded the familiar route to work. But as the day unfolded, I began to notice small details that made me pause, a sense that reality wasn't as fixed as it should be. Returning home from work one evening, I found my favorite mug, the chipped blue ceramic piece I'd used for years, exactly where I'd left it earlier. I distinctly remembered moving it aside to clear the table for dinner, yet it sat there as if undisturbed. At first, I blamed my own forgetfulness. But then a few hours later, I noticed it again in precisely the same spot, as if nothing had happened at all. The repetition was unnerving. The next day, on my commute, I caught sight of a sleek black sedan parked by the curb, a car I was certain I hadn't seen before. Yet as I continued walking, I encountered the same car again at a different corner. Later, while waiting at a crosswalk, it reappeared, idling silently, its presence persistent and inexplicable. I began to feel that time itself was looping, replaying the same scene without my consent. At home, the glitches multiplied. I entered my living room to find every item arranged exactly as I had left it, with not a single thing out of place, even though I was positive I tidied up differently that morning. One evening, as I sat in my favorite armchair reading, I glanced at the clock and realized it was showing a time that made no sense, as if it had skipped ahead and then reset. My remote, which I distinctly remembered setting aside, had inexplicably returned to its original position on the coffee table. It was as if the world around me was being forced into a rigid, unchanging pattern. On a quiet Sunday, I took a walk in the park, a place I'd always found comforting. As I strolled along the winding paths, I began noticing a woman in a red coat who kept appearing at odd intervals. The first time, I saw her seated on a weathered bench, reading a book. Moments later, she was there again, this time standing by a tree, then near a fountain. Each appearance was nearly identical, yet on closer inspection, her expression changed subtly, sometimes warm and inviting, other times blank and distant. I tried to approach her, but whenever I got close, she would vanish as if she were nothing more than a mirage. I started jotting down these occurrences in a worn notebook, listing the times and places where objects remained unchanged or events repeated. My entries became a chronicle of minute inconsistencies. A chair shifted ever so slightly, a door left open when I was sure I'd closed it, a conversation with a coworker that echoed exactly the same words on different days. At work, I began noticing that discussions and meetings sometimes looped, with colleagues repeating phrases word for word as if caught in a time loop. I asked around, but everyone insisted that nothing was out of the ordinary. They smiled politely at my concerns, attributing them to stress or overactive imagination. The more I observed, the more I felt that these glitches were not isolated coincidences, but parts of a larger, unyielding system. It was as if an unseen programmer had set the parameters of my reality, forcing everything to reset in a predetermined loop. One evening, I returned home from a late meeting, only to see the front door slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered locking it. Venturing inside, I discovered every object precisely where it should be, yet an odd sense of déjà vu overwhelmed me. I relocked the door with trembling hands, the feeling of being trapped in an unchanging script growing stronger with each passing moment. Late one night, unable to sleep, I sat in the dark of my living room, staring at the familiar silhouette of my desk and the same stack of papers that I knew I'd arranged that morning. I realized then that every detail in my life was locked into a repeating cycle. My memories, too, began to feel malleable, each recollection blurred with moments that contradicted one another. I recalled a conversation with a friend one way, only to find my recollection rewritten in my journal in a subtly different tone. Was I losing my mind, or was reality itself being edited? In a moment of desperate clarity, I confronted the possibility that the world I inhabited might be nothing more than a constructed illusion, a programmed environment where every object, every person, and every event was meticulously reset in an endless loop. The black sedan on the street, the woman in the red coat in the park, even the placement of my cherished mug. They were all pieces of an elaborate simulation that I had no power to change. I began to wonder if free will was merely an illusion, and if I was simply another character in a script that played the same way every day. Now, as I sit in my apartment, watching the static consistency of my surroundings, I feel an overwhelming sense of isolation. The glitches, once small and dismissible, have grown into undeniable markers of a reality that refuses to be dynamic. Every day is a careful repetition of the last, a loop that slowly erases the boundaries between what is real and what is programmed. I am no longer just an observer. I have become part of this relentless cycle, trapped in a reality where the familiar is nothing more than a carefully orchestrated facade. As I stare into the blank reflection of my window, I confront the unsettling possibility that everything I've ever known was fabricated, that the world itself might be nothing more than a glitch in the matrix. And in that final, haunting thought, I wonder if it even matters anymore. It started on an ordinary Thursday night after work. I'd taken my usual shortcut through a narrow, dimly lit side street to catch the bus home, not thinking much of the route since it was familiar enough. The drizzle had just begun, and the pavement reflected the flickering streetlights, giving the entire scene an almost cinematic quality. As I walked, I noticed a man leaning against a brick wall, half hidden in the shadows. At first, I assumed he was waiting for a ride, or perhaps sheltering from the rain. But something about him felt off. His eyes were too intense, fixed on me, and his posture was unnervingly still. I quickened my pace, trying to convince myself that it was merely a case of misplaced nerves after a long day. But as I passed him, he stepped off the wall and followed a few paces behind, his footsteps quiet on the wet concrete. I tried to catch a glimpse of his face, but the hood of his raincoat obscured most of it. His presence unsettled me, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. I told myself it was nothing more than paranoia, but a knot of anxiety began to form in my stomach. Later that night, when I finally reached my apartment, I discovered that my front door was slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd locked it. The thought made my skin crawl. Inside, everything appeared untouched except for a single detail. My living room window, which I distinctly remembered closing, was now open. A cold draft swept through the room, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I checked every room, every closet, but found no sign of an intruder. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd forgotten to close it properly, but the unease lingered like a shadow. The next morning, as I sipped my coffee and scrolled through my phone, I came across a local forum thread where a few people mentioned seeing a strange man lurking in the neighborhood. Their descriptions were eerily similar to the man I had seen. Dark hair, a weathered face barely visible beneath a hood, and an unsettling intensity in his gaze. One post mentioned that he had been seen asking odd, specific questions about local landmarks, as if he were searching for something. I felt a chill run down my spine. Was I just being paranoid, or was there something more sinister at play? Over the following days, my sense of dread grew. I began to notice subtle but disturbing changes in my daily routine. On one afternoon at the local grocery store, I caught a glimpse of that same stranger in the aisle, standing near the back and watching me intently. When I glanced his way, he quickly turned his head, as if hiding behind a wall of indifference, but his eyes still met mine for a fleeting moment. I try to brush it off. After all, coincidences happen. But deep down, I knew that this was no ordinary encounter. Then came the night that truly shattered my sense of safety. I was working late at the office, and as I finally made my way to my car in the parking lot, I noticed a figure at the far end of the row. The man was unmistakably the same stranger, leaning against a car with its lights off. My heart pounded as I realized he was following me. I hurried to my vehicle, fumbled with my keys, and jumped in just as he began to move. My hands trembled as I locked the doors, and I didn't dare glance back until I was safely inside my car. The realization hit me. I wasn't imagining it. This person was tracking me. That incident left an indelible mark on my psyche. I started receiving strange phone calls in the dead of night. A series of clicks, followed by a faint, gravelly whisper asking, "Are you alone?" The calls were brief, and when I checked the caller ID, it showed an unknown number that disappeared as quickly as it appeared. I reported the calls to the police, but without concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Friends tried to reassure me, insisting it was just a prank or a case of mistaken identity. But deep down, I knew that what I had encountered was far more dangerous. The situation escalated one rainy evening when I returned to my apartment to find a note slipped under my door. It was handwritten in a shaky script that sent shivers down my spine. "I know where you live. Let's not pretend we haven't met." I couldn't determine if the note was a threat or a twisted invitation. Panic surged through me as I dialed a friend to come over, but when I reached out to my building security, they dismissed it as a prank and assured me nothing was amiss. I spent the night barricaded in my bedroom, every creak and shadow on the wall igniting fresh waves of terror. Even now, I'm haunted by the memory of that stranger's face, an expressionless mask that seemed to hide endless secrets and malevolence. I no longer feel safe in my own home, and every dark, rainy night brings with it the fear that he might reappear at any moment. I've altered my routines, changed my routes, and even installed extra locks, yet the feeling of being pursued lingers relentlessly. Sometimes, when I step outside for a late walk, I can't shake the sensation of eyes following me, lurking just beyond the lamplight. I've come to realize that this isn't an isolated incident. Others have reported similar encounters, snippets of horror shared on local forums, and whispered among neighbors. The unsettling thought remains that this man isn't confined to one place or one target. He could be anywhere, watching, waiting for his moment. I now live with the constant, unnerving possibility that he's out there, a silent predator threading his way through the fabric of our everyday lives. And if you ever find yourself alone on a dark, rainy night, remember, the stranger with the unsettling gaze might just be closer than you think. I moved into the old brick apartment on a drizzly October afternoon, convinced that a change of scenery would help me rebuild my life. The building, tucked away on a quiet street in a town I barely knew, had character. A few creaking floorboards, a lingering scent of must and old memories, and neighbors who offered polite but distant smiles. At first, everything was as mundane as it appeared. I spent the first few days unpacking boxes, rearranging furniture, and exploring my new surroundings with cautious optimism. Yet, it wasn't long before subtle oddities began to intrude on my everyday routine. It started with small, inexplicable disturbances. I'd hear soft tapping sounds outside my door late at night, which I initially dismissed as the wind or the building's age working against itself. One evening, while reading in my favorite armchair, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape that disappeared as soon as I turned to look. I chalked it up to exhaustion and the play of shadows, insisting that there must be a rational explanation. However, the frequency of these incidents increased over the following weeks, and a nagging feeling of being observed began to seep into my consciousness. Determined to find a logical cause, I started keeping a detailed journal of every unusual occurrence. I noted the times when the mysterious tapping happened, recorded any changes in lighting or temperature, and even set up my old digital camera in the living room, hoping to capture evidence. Reviewing the footage later, I I found nothing but distorted static and fleeting blurs that couldn't be explained away by simple technical glitches. My rational mind fought hard to dismiss these anomalies as tricks of perception, yet the feeling of unease only deepened. One chilly evening, as I returned from a routine walk through the neighborhood, I noticed a man standing across the street. He was dressed in an old-fashioned coat and hat, his face partially shrouded in shadow. His eyes seemed to be fixed on the building, and for a brief moment, our gazes locked. I felt an inexplicable chill run down my spine, as if his stare was somehow meant for me. I tried to follow him, but he vanished around the corner of a narrow alleyway. I later rationalized that he must have been a local resident, albeit one with an unusual sense of fashion. Still, the encounter left me with lingering doubts about what I might be missing. The disturbances soon evolved into events that defied simple explanations. One night, while working on my laptop at my small desk, I heard a soft, melodic hum that seemed to seep through the walls. It wasn't loud enough to be intrusive, yet it held an odd, hypnotic quality. I knocked on the wall, half expecting a neighbor to answer, but there was only silence. The hum continued for several nights, always appearing at the same hour, as if in deliberate time with my restless sleep. I recorded the sound, only to have the playback reveal nothing more than a low, indistinct drone. Neighbors dismissed my concerns as mere coincidences or the product of overactive imagination. The most unnerving incident occurred on a stormy night. I had just settled in a bed when I heard slow, deliberate footsteps pacing the hallway outside my room. The building was silent, and I was sure no one else was awake. Gathering my courage, I crept to the door and peered out into the dim corridor. There, barely visible in the faint light of a flickering lamp, stood a figure. The person was shrouded in darkness, and though I couldn't see any distinct features, I felt an overwhelming sense of despair emanating from them. When I mustered the strength to speak, asking if everything was all right, the figure merely turned and melted into the shadows, leaving behind a silence so profound it roared in my ears. The morning after, I discovered an old, sepia-toned photograph left on my doorstep. It depicted a man and a woman, their eyes filled with a sorrow I couldn't quite place, as if they bore the weight of some unspoken tragedy. I felt a strange connection to them, though I couldn't explain why. Hoping to find answers, I began researching the history of the apartment building. I learned of a series of mysterious events that dated back decades. Stories of residents disappearing, unexplained sounds in the dead of night, and whispers of an inexplicable presence that seemed tied to the very walls of the place. A local historian confirmed that some believed the building was built atop land with a dark past, a nexus where the barrier between the known and the unknown was disturbingly thin. Despite my mounting evidence, every rational explanation I devised fell apart under scrutiny. I turned to online forums, sharing my experiences in hopes of connecting with others who might have witnessed similar phenomena. Most responses ranged from skeptical dismissals to comforting reassurances that I was simply overworked. Yet, a few posts recounted eerily similar occurrences, fleeting shadows, inexplicable sounds, and the persistent feeling of being watched. These shared accounts did little to soothe my unease. Instead, they deepened the mystery, suggesting that the events might be part of something far larger and more sinister than mere coincidences. Now, I find myself torn between a desperate need for logical answers and the growing realization that some things might defy explanation altogether. Each night, as I lie awake listening for that haunting hum or the soft echo of footsteps in the corridor, I wonder if the disturbances are a product of my imagination or if I have inadvertently become entangled in a mystery that stretches back generations. Who was the man who watched me on that fateful evening? What is the origin of the melancholic hum that now punctuates my nights? And how do the faded faces in that mysterious photograph connect to the inexplicable events in this building? I have yet to uncover definitive answers. My recordings yield nothing conclusive, and my journal entries only paint a picture of fragmented clues and mounting dread. I now live with the constant uncertainty of whether what I experienced was the result of a series of bizarre coincidences or if something beyond our understanding is at work. The truth, if it ever reveals itself, might be far more unsettling than I can imagine. And as I continue to search for explanations, the questions linger, unanswered and echoing in the silent corners of this old apartment, leaving me to wonder if I have merely scratched the surface of a phenomenon that defies all logic. It began with something trivial, a set of keys misplaced on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I distinctly remembered leaving them on the small table by the door, but when I reached for them, they were nowhere to be found. I searched every conceivable corner of my modest apartment, chalking it up to my absent-mindedness after a long week at work. That day, however, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. I replaced the lost keys with a spare and dismissed the incident as an isolated lapse in memory. The following day, I experienced another minor oddity. While making my morning coffee, I swore I heard a soft, almost musical hum drifting from the hallway, a sound that sounded eerily familiar, like a lullaby my mother used to sing. I paused, listened intently, and then resumed my routine when the melody faded into silence. I mentioned it casually to my neighbor, Mrs. Carlyle, but she only smiled politely and said, "Sometimes the house makes its own music." Her nonchalant response should have reassured me, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was witnessing something inexplicable. As the week wore on, these small incidents began to accumulate. I'd return home to find items subtly shifted from where I'd left them. A book I was sure I'd placed on the coffee table would later appear on my nightstand. A pair of reading glasses found in the kitchen reappeared in the bathroom sink. I tried to rationalize these anomalies as the result of my own forgetfulness or the distractions of daily life, but a growing unease settled in my gut, a sense that the fabric of my reality was slowly unraveling. Then came the day when conversations with those around me began to feel disjointed. At the local grocery store, I greeted a man whom I recognized from previous visits. We exchanged a few words about the weather, and I recalled laughing together over a shared joke. Yet, when I later recounted the encounter to a friend, he looked at me as if I were describing a completely different event. Even more disturbing, that same man, when I met him again a few days later, seemed not to remember our last conversation at all. His expression was blank, as if the memory had been wiped clean. I began to wonder if I was the only one who retained these moments, while everyone else acted as though the events had never happened. I started keeping a detailed journal, determined to document every instance of these inexplicable changes. I noted the times when a door would be found ajar, when the lights flickered in a pattern that almost mimicked Morse code, and when familiar voices uttered words that I was sure I had already heard. One entry described a peculiar afternoon walk in the park, where I encountered a small group of people sitting on a bench. They chatted animatedly, yet when I approached and greeted them, their faces registered a confused blankness. As if I had interrupted an act in a play they were compelled to forget immediately after it was performed. I left them standing there, their eyes void of recognition, and continued on my way, haunted by the unsettling notion that I was the only one aware of these shifts. One evening, I returned home late from work to find my apartment bathed in a strange, muted light that I couldn't quite explain. The furniture was arranged differently than I remembered. Even the paintings on the walls seemed to have been rotated or replaced with ones I'd never seen before. I attempted to call my roommate, who had been out of town for days, only to be met with silence on the line. When I finally managed to speak with her the next morning, she insisted that nothing out of the ordinary had happened during her absence. I showed her my journal, the entries detailing the misplaced keys, the inexplicable shifts in conversation, the rearranged room, and her expression turned to one of puzzled concern, as if she were reading someone else's diary. The most disconcerting moment came one cold, rain-soaked night. I sat in my living room, trying to piece together the fragments of my increasingly erratic day when I heard a knock at the door. The sound was soft, almost hesitant, and when I opened the door, I was met with an empty hallway shrouded in darkness. But something was different, an unsettling silence, a palpable void that seemed to swallow the sound of my own heartbeat. I stepped out, calling into the darkness, but received no reply. Returning inside, I noticed that the hallway mirror no longer reflected my own image, but instead showed a figure standing behind me. A figure that vanished the moment I turned to confront it. My rational mind fought to dismiss it as a trick of the light, yet deep down, I knew I wasn't simply imagining things. Now, as days blur into nights, I find myself increasingly estranged from the life I once knew. Every object, every conversation, every small moment is tainted by the creeping sense that something is orchestrating these subtle manipulations. I wander through my apartment as if I'm a visitor in a place I once called home, watching as reality slips from my grasp like sand through trembling fingers. I try to share my experiences with friends and family, but their reassurances and puzzled expressions only add to my isolation. They seem to move through the same day-to-day routines, oblivious to the small, disquieting changes that plague me. I am left questioning whether I am truly losing my mind or if there is something or someone else rewriting the script of my life. The more I document, the more I feel like a mere bystander in events I once actively participated in. I no longer trust my memories, and every new anomaly leaves me stranded between the comfort of the known and the terror of an unseen force at work. Perhaps I'm being manipulated by something beyond my understanding, or maybe the world around me is unraveling in a way that defies logic. Tonight, I sit by a dimly lit window, watching the rain trace unpredictable patterns down the glass. My journal lies open on the table, pages filled with accounts of the unexplainable. Yet I fear that even these records may be subject to change. I wonder if tomorrow will bring clarity or if it will only serve to further blur the lines between reality and illusion. The unanswered questions gnaw at me, leaving me to face the cold possibility that I am no longer the master of my own story. And as I close my journal, I can't help but feel that somewhere in the distance, unseen hands are rewriting the next chapter of my life, one that I may never fully understand. I never thought that a chance encounter could shatter your sense of security until I met Adrian. It all began during a business trip in a city that still smelled of rain and old brick. I had just checked into a modest hotel with creaking floors and faded wallpaper when I first noticed him. Standing in the lobby by the reception desk, his warm eyes and friendly smile offered an unspoken welcome. He introduced himself casually, complimenting my choice of hotel and even recommending a little-known cafe in a quieter part of town. His interest seemed harmless enough, even kind, and I chalked it up to a friendly local eager to share his city. Over the next few days, however, I began to notice little details that unsettled me. I'd see Adrian in places I'd never expect him. At the cafe where I spent a slow morning reading, in the park while I was jogging, and even near the bookstore where I picked up a novel on a whim. At first, these encounters appeared to be nothing more than coincidences, a quirk of fate that made me feel strangely observed in a city full of strangers. Yet, with each subsequent meeting, the details of our interactions grew increasingly disquieting. On the second day, while enjoying a cup of tea at a sunlit table in the cafe, I was startled when Adrian approached and sat down uninvited. In a soft tone, he remarked, "I couldn't help but notice that you always choose the window seat. There's a reason you do, isn't there?" I had never mentioned my preference for solitude or my habit of watching people pass by. His comment, casual as it was, struck me as eerily specific. I smiled nervously and changed the subject, but a chill settled over me as I realized that he must have been paying far closer attention than any friendly stranger should. The unease deepened on the third day. I was returning from a late meeting when I noticed him again, leaning against a lamppost outside my hotel. In the dim glow of the streetlight, he offered a small wave and said, "I was just wondering if you ever stop for a moment to admire the rain." It was an odd greeting, as if he'd been waiting to hear my thoughts on something so trivial. I couldn't shake the feeling that his presence was timed perfectly to coincide with moments when I felt most vulnerable, like a silent sentinel who knew too much about me. Then came the incident that shattered any illusion of innocent coincidence. One gloomy evening, as I walked back to my room after dinner, I felt a sudden prickling on the back of my neck. Glancing over my shoulder, I saw Adrian a few paces behind me, his eyes fixed with an intensity that bordered on predatory. When I stopped to catch my breath, I found him already a step closer, smiling as if we were old friends reunited. "I remember you telling me about your favorite spot in the park," he murmured, and my heart skipped a beat. I had never mentioned that place to anyone, not even in passing conversation. The realization that he knew details about my personal life that I had never shared sent a surge of panic through me. In a desperate bid for clarity, I began to document every encounter. I noted the exact time and place, the tone of his voice, and the precise details he mentioned, details that, inexplicably, reflected moments from my private life. I asked colleagues and locals if they had ever seen him, but their responses were vague, as if he were a ghost drifting through their memories. Every time I tried to broach the subject directly, his answers were cryptic, hinting at shared experiences that I couldn't recall, and leaving me more confused than reassured. One night, after a particularly exhausting day, I returned to my room only to find a folded note slipped under the door. In an elegant, unfamiliar handwriting, it read, "I see you. I know where you've been, and I know what you hide." The note was both a threat and an invitation, a chilling reminder that he was not merely a harmless acquaintance. I felt exposed, as if my life were being cataloged in a file that only he had access to. My sleep became a restless vigil punctuated by the fear of unexpected knocks on my door or the sound of a car idling outside. Now, every time I leave my room or venture out, I am hyper-aware of every shadow and every stranger's glance. My once simple daily routine has turned into a series of calculated risks, and the comforting anonymity of the city has transformed into a labyrinth of suspicion. I have changed my routes, altered my schedule, and even considered contacting the police, but every lead about Adrian dissolves into vague whispers and uncertain theories. Friends advise me to ignore it all, to chalk it up to coincidence or overactive nerves, yet the memory of his kind, yet unervingly precise smile haunts me. I lie awake at night, my mind racing with the possibility that every friendly compliment and every casual remark was a carefully orchestrated move in an obsessive game. Am I simply misinterpreting coincidences? Or is someone out there, someone who knows more about my life than I ever intended to share, tracking my every move? The rational part of me wants to dismiss it as a series of unfortunate events, but the nagging fear that I am being watched, cataloged, and perhaps even manipulated refuses to fade. As I sit here in the dim light of my room, I find myself questioning every fleeting encounter and every kind word that now seems laced with hidden intent. I've scoured social media for clues, searched through local forums for any mention of a man matching his description, but all I find are fragmented stories and uneasy glances from strangers who might have felt the same inexplicable presence. I'm left with an unsettling question. Is this all just a series of coincidences? A trick of fate and an overactive imagination? Or am I truly being tracked by someone with motives I can't fathom? And if it's the latter, how long before I can no longer tell where my life ends and his obsession begins? I first encountered him on an ordinary Thursday afternoon at a quiet little cafe just off Main Street. I was sipping my usual latte and scribbling in my notebook when I noticed a man sitting at the adjacent table, absorbed in his phone. He wore a navy blue jacket and offered a kind, almost inviting smile when the barista called out his order. At first, I dismissed him as just another customer in a city filled with strangers. But over the next few days, I began to notice a pattern that sent an inexplicable chill down my spine. One morning, on my way to work, I took my usual shortcut through the local park. There, seated on a worn bench beneath a gnarled oak, was the same man, reading a newspaper with deliberate calm. I was startled. I had never seen him there before, yet his presence was unmistakable. I tried to shrug it off as mere coincidence and hurried along the winding path. However, his appearances soon became too frequent to ignore. I started catching fleeting glimpses of him in unexpected places. At the subway station during my morning commute, I'd see him leaning casually against a pillar, his eyes scanning the crowd as if searching for something or someone. On another day, I passed him near the corner store in the early evening, his figure illuminated briefly by the neon sign above the door. Each time, his gaze seemed to linger just a moment too long, locking onto mine before he blended into the background. I began to wonder if I was simply overanalyzing chance encounters in a busy city, but a growing sense of unease persisted. The situation escalated one rainy night as I returned from a late shift. The streets were nearly empty, slick with rain and shrouded in a foggy mist that blurred the edges of everything familiar. As I walked, I noticed him standing under a flickering street lamp at the far end of the block. His eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, intense, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. Panic surged through me, and I quickened my pace, fumbling with my keys as I fumbled to secure my car. When I finally locked the doors, I dared a glance in the rearview mirror, but he had vanished, leaving only the memory of that piercing stare. In the days that followed, my anxiety deepened. I began receiving strange, anonymous messages on social media, cryptic compliments on my blog posts, remarks like our paths are intertwined, and even a few photos taken from a distance that captured me outside my favorite coffee shop. Each message was wrapped in polite language, yet they carried a disturbing intimacy that made my skin crawl. I mentioned the messages to a coworker, but they insisted it was nothing more than harmless coincidence. Still, the nagging thought that I was being observed, perhaps even tracked, would not leave me. The turning point came one crisp morning when I arrived at work to find a neatly folded note taped to my office door. In elegant, flowing handwriting, it read, "I see you always in the same moments, always in the same places. Chance is a poor excuse for fate." My hands trembled as I reread the note, each word etching a deeper sense of vulnerability into my mind. I searched my memory for that handwriting, wondering if I had seen it before, but it eluded me entirely. Desperation led me to confront him once. On a particularly overcast afternoon, I spotted him sitting on the same park bench again. My heart pounded as I approached, voice wavering when I asked, "Do I know you?" He looked up slowly, his eyes calm and unreadable, and replied, "Perhaps in another time." His answer was cryptic, and rather than alleviating my fears, it only deepened the mystery surrounding his intentions. I left the bench with more questions than answers, feeling increasingly like I was becoming a pawn in someone else's twisted game. Even now, as I navigate my daily routines, I find myself scanning every face, every passerby, for that unmistakable look, a calm demeanor masking something far more sinister. I recall the night I heard soft footsteps outside my window, a sound that set my nerves on edge. Peeking through the curtains, I saw nothing but the empty street, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that his presence lingered in the darkness, waiting for another chance to make itself known. Every time I leave my apartment or board a bus, a part of me remains hyper-alert, haunted by the possibility that he might be following my every move. My sleep is fractured by nightmares in which his steady gaze pierces through the darkness, and the boundary between coincidence and calculated observation blurs with each passing day. I have altered my routines, avoided the usual spots I once found comforting, yet no matter what I do, the sense of being watched never fully dissipates. Even as I write this, a gnawing uncertainty persists. Am I merely overreacting to a series of unfortunate coincidences? Or is there truly someone out there, meticulously tracking my movements? Each encounter, each cryptic message, and every fleeting glimpse of his familiar face leaves me questioning whether I am simply caught in an odd series of events or if I've become the target of a deliberate, unsettling obsession. As I close my door tonight, I can't help but wonder, is this all just a series of coincidences? Or am I being stalked by someone with motives I can't begin to comprehend? I never thought a simple visit home could unravel the fabric of reality, but that's exactly what happened one cold November evening. I had returned to my childhood house to settle my late grandmother's affairs, expecting to find solace in memories of a bygone era. The house, with its creaking wooden floors and faint scent of lavender potpourri, had always been a place of comfort. But as I stepped through the front door that night, a deep sense of foreboding washed over me, as if the walls themselves harbored a dark secret. At first, nothing seemed amiss. I spent the early evening sorting through old photographs and letters in the parlor, reminiscing about summers spent under the warm sun and winters filled with laughter by the fire. Yet as midnight approached, small, inexplicable details began to disturb the quiet. In the hallway mirror, I caught a glimpse of a shadow moving behind me, only to vanish when I turned. I rationalized it as a trick of light and fatigue, convincing myself that grief had clouded my judgment. The following day brought more unsettling events. I discovered that doors I had firmly closed were left ajar, and in the silence of the empty house, I heard soft, almost melodic humming that sent chills down my spine. It was a lullaby my grandmother used to sing, yet there was no one there. My heart pounded as I followed the sound, only to find empty rooms that seemed to echo with an unseen presence. The unease grew when I noticed that cherished family portraits were slightly askew, as if someone had handled them with deliberate care. In one faded photograph of my grandmother, her eyes appeared to be scratched out, a detail so precise and horrifying that I couldn't attribute it to mere decay or faulty memory. Determined to find a rational explanation, I began documenting each strange occurrence. I noted the times when the humming began, the particular doors that were left open, and the minute changes in the arrangement of relics I held dear. My logical mind insisted that the old house, with its natural creaks and groans, could be playing tricks on me. But deep within, a primal fear took root. That fear was confirmed one stormy night when I awoke to the sound of deliberate footsteps in the attic. I lay frozen, listening as the steps paced slowly across the wooden beams, pausing at intervals, as if someone were inspecting the dark corners of that forgotten space. Summoning every ounce of courage, I climbed the attic stairs, only to find nothing but dusty memories and cobwebbed corners. Yet the sensation of being watched persisted, pressing relentlessly against my consciousness. The final, shattering moment came when I discovered a folded note tucked under the door of my old bedroom. In spidery handwriting it read, "I see you. I know your secrets." My blood turned to ice as I realized this was no trick of my imagination. The note was not written in any style I recognized, and I found no indication of who could have left it. That night, every creak of the house became a sinister whisper, every shifting shadow a lurking menace. I could no longer dismiss these events as mere coincidences or products of an overactive, grief-stricken mind. I was certain that something unexplainable had taken root in that house, a presence that defied logic and reason. I left the house the following morning with my belongings hastily packed, the note clutched tightly in my trembling hand. In the weeks since, I have agonized over trying to piece together a logical explanation for what happened, but every theory crumbles under scrutiny. The experience was not a fabrication of my imagination, nor can it be chalked up to the quirks of an old building. It was real, a terrifying encounter with a force beyond human understanding. Even now, as I write these words, I cannot shake the chilling certainty that something sinister lingers in the dark corners of that home, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to cross its threshold. I know what I experienced was genuine, and the memory of that night haunts me with every passing day. A stark reminder that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, and that the inexplicable can be terrifyingly real. I moved into a modest apartment on a quiet street last month. Thinking a fresh start might help me escape the monotony of my previous life. At first, everything felt ordinary. The creaking floorboards, the faded wallpaper, and the distant hum of traffic blending with the whisper of the wind. Yet within days, small oddities began to disrupt my routine. It started with trivial incidents. A misplaced coffee mug that reappeared on my kitchen counter after I was certain I'd discarded it. A creaking door in the hallway at night that I attributed to the building's age. I reassured myself that these were mere coincidences, products of fatigue and the stress of settling into a new place. One morning, as I prepared breakfast, I discovered that my favorite pen was missing from its usual spot on the desk. I vividly remembered setting it there, yet it had vanished without a trace. Later that day at the grocery store, I caught sight of a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to a friend from my childhood, someone I hadn't seen in years and never expected to encounter in this part of town. The brief encounter left me questioning my memory and wondering if I had simply mistaken him for someone else. Over the next several days, the anomalies multiplied. Objects disappeared from one room only to reappear in another, and I began to overhear fragments of conversation in otherwise silent corridors. At times, a familiar voice seemed to whisper my name from an empty room, sending chills down my spine. Desperate for answers, I started keeping a detailed journal. Every odd occurrence was meticulously noted. The time when a securely locked door creaked open on its own, the fleeting glimpse of a shadowy figure reflected in a window, and the disconcerting sound of soft laughter echoing down vacant hallways. My logical mind insisted that these were errors, misplaced recollections, tricks of the light, or perhaps even my own imagination running wild. Yet, as each day passed, the events grew more frequent and defied all logical explanation. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, I returned home to find my living room in complete disarray. Books lay scattered on the floor, and the cushions on my sofa were tossed aside as if in a sudden struggle. Strangely, nothing appeared to be stolen. It was as if chaos itself had swept through the room. When I mentioned the incident to Ms. Granger, my kindly neighbor, she simply smiled and said, "Sometimes things just happen," as though it were an everyday occurrence. Her nonchalant dismissal did nothing to quell the mounting dread within me. As the weeks turned into a blur of restless nights and uneasy days, I began noticing patterns that defied explanation. A soft, almost imperceptible lullaby would drift through the thin walls at night, a melody my mother once sang, long before I had forgotten its words. Shadows moved at the edge of my vision, vanishing whenever I tried to focus on them. I started to feel an ever-present sensation of being watched, a quiet but persistent feeling that clung to me in the solitude of my apartment. I shared these experiences with friends, only to receive concerned looks and gentle suggestions that stress was playing tricks on my mind. Yet, when I described the inexplicable details, the shifting of furniture, fleeting reflections of unknown faces, and sounds that evoked memories of the past, they exchanged hesitant glances, as if silently acknowledging a secret too disturbing to confront. The line between reality and imagination began to blur. I would step into a room and swear its layout had subtly changed, or catch a glimpse of a stranger in the mirror that disappeared the moment I turned. Every time I constructed a rational explanation, a new anomaly shattered my certainty. Last night, I heard a soft knock at my door accompanied by a whisper calling my name in a voice that felt both familiar and distant. I hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity, and when I finally opened the door, I was met only by a dimly lit, empty corridor. In that moment, I was left to wonder, are these occurrences manifestations of something beyond my understanding, or are they simply the fragments of a mind unraveling under pressure? Now, as I sit alone in the subdued glow of my living room, uncertainty consumes me. I document these events in hopes of piecing together a logical explanation. But each new incident only deepens the mystery. Are these anomalies real, or is my grasp on reality slipping away? Every disappearing object, every fleeting shadow, every whispered sound forces me to confront the possibility that I might be losing my sanity. And yet, a stubborn part of me clings to the belief that there is something tangible behind these occurrences, a hidden truth waiting to be discovered. I remain suspended between two unsettling possibilities, one in which an inexplicable force weaves its way through my daily life, and another in which my mind is betraying me. As the night deepens and familiar sounds resurface, I am left with more questions than answers, teetering on the edge of a reality that might be more fragile than I ever imagined. I remain in this uncertain state, haunted by the possibility that every seemingly trivial anomaly is the prelude to something far greater and more sinister. With each passing moment, I question whether the world around me is as it appears, or if I have stepped into a realm where the boundary between the real and the imagined has all but vanished. I never believed in the supernatural, But the events that unfolded one bitter winter shattered all my certainties. I moved into an aging apartment on the edge of town after a painful breakup, hoping for a fresh start in solitude. The building's narrow, dimly lit corridors and creaking floors exuded a quiet despair that I initially chalked up to neglect. Yet as the nights lengthened and the wind howled outside, an unsettling presence began to make itself known. At first, it was small things. A door left slightly ajar that I was sure I'd locked, an inexplicable chill that seeped into the room even with the windows closed. Then, in the dead of night, I started hearing soft murmurs that seemed to come from within the very walls. Lying awake, heart pounding in the oppressive silence, I distinctly heard a voice whisper, "You cannot hide." I dismissed it as a trick of my overtaxed mind, a product of loneliness and exhaustion. Days blurred together as the disturbances escalated. Shadows moved with a will of their own in the corners of my vision, and every creak of the ancient would make me flinch. I began keeping a journal, desperate to rationalize the inexplicable occurrences. But no matter how meticulously I recorded each anomaly, the flickering lights in the corridor, the fleeting glimpse of a gaunt figure at the edge of my peripheral vision, the inexplicable scraping sounds echoing in empty hallways, my evidence only deepened the mystery. I even found an old, sepia-toned photograph tucked behind a loose brick near my door. In it, a sorrowful woman in a faded blue dress stared directly at me, her eyes filled with a grief that felt all too personal. One night, as a frigid wind rattled the window panes, I awoke to a presence at the foot of my bed. I couldn't see it clearly, but I felt its malign energy, a cold, invasive force that pressed against my skin. The whisper came again, more insistent this time. "Remember me." In a moment of terror, I bolted upright, straining to catch a glimpse of anything unnatural in the darkness. For a split second, I saw a shadowy figure with hollow eyes hovering by the doorway, only to vanish when I fumbled for the light. That image has since haunted every silent moment. In the following weeks, the building itself seemed to conspire against me. Corridors stretched impossibly long, and odd symbols, scratched hastily into the peeling paint, appeared in places I'd never noticed before. Even my attempts to record these events on my phone yielded only distorted static and fleeting images that vanished on playback. Neighbors offered little comfort, dismissing my accounts as the ramblings of someone isolated and sleep-deprived. Yet whispers of local legends began to surface. A tragic tale of a woman wronged, doomed to wander these halls, her spirit tethered to the building by an unfulfilled desire for vengeance and recognition. Desperate for answers, I ventured into a forgotten wing of the apartment one evening. The corridor there was lined with ancient portraits whose eyes seemed to follow my every move. One portrait in particular, a woman in a tattered blue dress, appeared to shift imperceptibly, her lips parting as if to speak. In that charged moment, I felt an overwhelming sadness and an eerie familiarity, as though I had encountered her before in a different life or a forgotten nightmare. Her silent plea, "Remember me," echoed in my mind long after I fled the room in terror. I eventually left that place, but I cannot say I am free of its haunting influence. In my new home, quiet moments are shattered by inexplicable chills and distant, disembodied voices that seem to call my name. I now record these memories as both a confession and a warning. The experience defies logic. Was it a product of my fragile state of mind, or did I truly awaken something malevolent and ancient? Even as I write these words, I sense that the entity lingers, stalking the threshold between our world and something far darker. The terror has become a constant companion, a reminder that some mysteries remain unsolved and that, in the end, we may never truly escape the past. And sometimes, when the night is at its darkest, I can still hear that chilling whisper, "You cannot hide." I first noticed something was off on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I was in my small apartment making coffee when I reached for my favorite mug, the one with the faded red stripes that had been in my cupboard for years, but it wasn't there. Instead, an identical mug with a slightly different shade of red sat where I usually kept it, I paused, blinking in disbelief. At first, I convinced myself I must have moved it absent-mindedly, but a creeping unease took root. Over the next few days, more small discrepancies emerged. My keys, always hanging on the same hook by the door, were sometimes found on the counter or even in a different drawer altogether. I began to notice subtle alterations in the layout of my living room. The arrangement of books on my shelf, once meticulously ordered by genre, now appeared to have been rearranged overnight. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness, a trick of the tired mind. Yet, deep inside, a gnawing feeling insisted that something was deliberately amiss. It wasn't long before the changes grew stranger. One evening, as I returned from work, I found a thin, almost imperceptible smear of what looked like chalk or powder on my front door frame. It formed a pattern that I couldn't quite decipher, a series of shapes that might have been numbers or symbols. I asked my neighbor, Mrs. Delgado, if she'd seen anything unusual, but she only frowned and muttered that everything looked normal to her. When I mentioned the missing mug and misplaced keys, she offered a concerned shake of her head, insisting I must be overworked. But the images and feelings remained vivid in my mind. Late at night, while trying to sleep, I began hearing soft sounds that couldn't be explained. A faint rustling in the hallway outside my door, the whisper of footsteps that faded as soon as I listened intently. One night, I crept out of bed, heart hammering, and crept to the living room only to find nothing out of place. The silence was as oppressive as it was empty, yet I could feel eyes on me. The sensation persisted during the day, too. At work, I caught colleagues mentioning conversations that I was sure I'd had with them the day before. Details about weekend plans, small anecdotes. But when I asked for clarification later, they dismissed my recollection as a misunderstanding. It felt as if parts of my reality had been erased or overwritten. Then came the note. I came home one evening to find a small piece of paper tucked under my door. In neat, deliberate handwriting, it read, "Everything changes. Do you?" The message sent a chill down my spine. I asked around, desperate for someone to confirm that something unusual was happening, but everyone insisted nothing was wrong. The building's security cameras showed nothing out of the ordinary, and even Mrs. Delgado maintained that she'd seen nothing amiss. I started documenting every oddity in a battered notebook, each misplaced object, every altered detail, every moment of disorientation, hoping to piece together a logical explanation. But the more I recorded, the less sense the world around me made. One particularly disconcerting night, I woke up at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of soft scratching coming from somewhere behind the living room wall. I crept towards it, straining to see through the darkened corridor, only to find an empty space and a lingering chill. The scratching stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so heavy it pressed against my ears. In the days that followed, I noticed that even my own memories seemed unreliable. I'd vividly recall locking my apartment door before leaving for work, only to return and find it slightly ajar. I'd swear I'd left a book on the coffee table, only to discover it on my nightstand. Even the photographs on my walls seemed to have been altered. Faces that once smiled warmly now appeared somber, their eyes hiding secrets I couldn't decipher. Every attempt to share my experience with friends or family was met with dismissals. "Maybe you're just stressed," they'd say, "or it's just your imagination." I started doubting myself, questioning whether these were real phenomena or figments of an overactive, anxious mind. But deep down, I knew that these changes weren't random. There was a deliberate pattern, a hidden hand rewriting the small details of my life, piece by piece, as if testing my grip on reality. Now, as I sit in my increasingly alien home, every familiar object feels like a stranger. Every shadow hides secrets I'm not meant to see. I'm left wondering if the world I once knew has been subtly corrupted, if every memory and every detail is being manipulated by something beyond my comprehension. The creeping alterations have become my constant companions, a silent reminder that nothing is as it once was. I fear that I'm trapped in a reality that everyone else perceives as normal. Yet to me, it has turned hostile and unpredictable. I have no proof beyond my own eyes, no confirmation from anyone else, only a lingering, bone-deep certainty that something is orchestrating these changes. And as I write this, I can't help but wonder, was it all just my perception? Or is there something far more sinister behind these inexplicable events? I used to believe that every day unfolded predictably, until the day it didn't. I remember that morning vividly. I was on my usual route to work, the sun just beginning to climb above the horizon, when I caught a glimpse of my neighbor, Mr. Klein, walking his dog. But something about him was off. As I passed by, he waved cheerfully, but his eyes were distant, as if he were reciting a memorized greeting. I shrugged it off. Perhaps he was just lost in thought. Yet that same day, I encountered the strangest phenomenon at a coffee shop where I'd stopped for my morning fix. I sat by the window, stirring my latte absent-mindedly, when I noticed the barista repeat my order word for word, even though I hadn't spoken up. It was as if he anticipated every detail of my request, down to the exact temperature of the milk. I felt a fleeting chill, wondering if I was merely imagining things. Over the next several days, the oddities multiplied. I began to notice small repetitions that I couldn't explain. On my commute, I encountered the same person, always wearing a dark hoodie, always standing in the same spot at the bus stop, despite having taken different routes and even different buses. At work, during a routine meeting, I found that a colleague recited an entire paragraph I had just uttered minutes before, as if our conversation had been recorded and replayed. I started questioning my own recollections. Was I truly speaking, or was I merely echoing something I'd heard moments ago? The sensation of déjà vu was overwhelming. I'd walk into my apartment and see a reflection in a mirror that lagged just a fraction behind my own movements. Once, I even caught a glimpse of myself in a shop window, and as I turned away, the reflection lingered, smiling back long after I'd stopped. I set up my phone to record these moments, only to find that when I reviewed the footage, everything appeared normal, except for that inexplicable delay in the mirror's reflection. The phenomenon was subtle, yet every occurrence left me feeling increasingly disoriented. One evening, as dusk fell and the world outside took on an eerie calm, I was driving home when I noticed something that made my heart race. I was certain I had taken a different exit than usual, yet there, in the rearview mirror, was the same stretch of road I'd passed just minutes before. It was as if time had looped back on itself. I pulled over, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, and sat there for what felt like an eternity, watching the world repeat in slow motion. When I finally resumed driving, everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just witnessed a glitch in the very fabric of reality. Desperation drove me to search for answers. I scoured online forums, only to find scattered accounts of similar experiences. Strange, repeating moments, fleeting echoes of conversations, and inexplicable lags in reflections. Some dismissed these as coincidences, while others whispered of a deeper, more disturbing truth, that reality might be nothing more than a carefully constructed simulation, prone to glitches and errors. The more I read, the more I began to suspect that I wasn't alone in experiencing these anomalies. Yet, every time I tried to discuss it with friends or colleagues, they looked at me as if I were mad, insisting that everything was perfectly normal. Now, as I sit in the dim light of my living room, I can't help but feel that something is fundamentally broken. The same streets, the same faces, the same routine. Yet every day there are tiny, inexplicable changes that hint at a larger, unseen malfunction. I am haunted by the relentless repetition of moments that should be unique, by the subtle delay of my own reflection, by the persistent feeling that time is slipping through my fingers like grains of sand. The world around me seems to be caught in a loop, a broken record that repeats itself over and over, each iteration more disconcerting than the last. I fear that I have become part of a cosmic error, an anomaly in a system that I can no longer trust. I'm left with more questions than answers, my mind teetering on the edge of a reality that may be nothing more than a glitch, a shattered mirror reflecting a world that has lost its coherence. And as I write these words, I'm increasingly convinced that something is very, very wrong, though I cannot tell if I have become part of something bigger or if reality itself has finally broken down. I moved into the new apartment on a whim, a last-minute decision spurred by the lure of a quieter life away from the chaos of the city. The building was modest, unremarkable even, with creaking floors and a dim lobby that smelled faintly of old books and dust. On my first day, everything felt ordinary enough. I spent the afternoon unpacking, arranging my few belongings with the care of someone starting fresh. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the hum of the radiator, I couldn't shake a slight feeling of being observed, but I dismissed it as my imagination. A week into my new life, I met my neighbor, Mrs. Halloway, a kindly older woman who always wore a neat scarf and greeted everyone with a warm smile. Our conversations were brief, polite exchanges about the weather or the building's quirks, nothing out of the ordinary. But one afternoon, while returning from the grocery store, I noticed something odd. The corridor outside my door, usually silent and still, seemed to be filled with whispers. I stopped and listened, heart pounding, but the voices faded as soon as I focused on them. I wondered if it was just the wind or the building's age playing tricks on my ears. Over the next few days, small but unsettling changes began to occur. I'd return home to find objects slightly out of place. My favorite mug, which I had always kept on the side table, now resting on the kitchen counter. I would open a closet door only to find the contents rearranged in a way I definitely hadn't done. At first, I convinced myself that I must have been distracted or tired, but the consistency of these events gnawed at me. One evening, I discovered a folded note tucked under my door. It read simply, "You're not alone," in a neat, unfamiliar handwriting. When I mentioned it to Mrs. Halloway the next morning, she simply patted my hand and said, "Maybe it's just your nerves, dear." But her eyes were distant, and I wasn't sure I believed her. Work provided no refuge either. My routine was comforting, and the faces of my colleagues were familiar, but something in their behavior began to shift. Conversations that once flowed naturally now stuttered with awkward pauses, as if each person was trying to recall details from a previous conversation that didn't quite match what I remembered. I overheard one coworker remark, "I don't remember discussing that yesterday," while I was certain I had. I started to question whether I was misremembering things or if something more sinister was at play. My reflection in the office's glass panels began to seem delayed, like a brief echo of my movements, and I swore I saw a stranger's face lurking in the background of a video call, only to vanish when I blinked. The disquiet grew into a gnawing terror when I began experiencing lapses in time. One afternoon, I left my apartment for a walk in the park and returned to find that hours had passed without any recollection of how the time had slipped away. My phone's timestamp was inexplicably ahead, and I had missed an important call from a friend who insisted I had agreed to meet them that day. I tried to piece together the fragmented hours, but my notes and memories were disjointed, like pages torn from a diary written by someone else. I felt as if I were living in two overlapping realities, one that everyone else seemed to experience normally, and another that was full of inexplicable gaps and subtle alterations. Then came the night that sealed my growing conviction that I wasn't just losing my mind. I returned home from work to find the apartment door slightly ajar, even though I was sure I had locked it. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, the air unnervingly still. I flipped on the lights and discovered that my living room was arranged differently. The sofa was angled in a way I never set it, and a family photograph had been rotated so that the faces looked backward. I combed through each room, my pulse racing, only to find that nothing appeared overtly wrong, except for these minute changes that piled up like breadcrumbs leading nowhere. I called my friend Mark, desperate for reassurance, but he laughed it off, saying I must be overreacting. His laughter only deepened my isolation. As the weeks wore on, the changes became more alarming. I began receiving cryptic messages on my voicemail from an unknown number, snippets of voices that said things like, "Time is stolen," and "Your world is not fixed." At first, I thought it was a cruel prank, but then I started noticing that the voices sounded eerily familiar, almost like echoes of my own thoughts. I tried to record them, but each time the recording would cut out abruptly, leaving only static behind. The walls of my apartment, once comforting in their solidity, now felt like they were shifting imperceptibly with every tick of the clock. Every attempt to share my experiences with others was met with denial or dismissive smiles. Even Mrs. Holloway, who had once been a pillar of comfort, insisted that nothing was wrong, though I noticed she glanced over her shoulder as if expecting to see someone behind her. The people around me were either oblivious or unwilling to acknowledge the mounting changes, leaving me to wonder if I was the only one trapped in a warped version of reality. Now, as I sit in the darkness of my apartment, the silence around me feels oppressive. I lie awake, heart pounding, as I watch the shadows shift across the walls in patterns that make no sense. The ordinary world I once trusted has become something alien and hostile, a place where time slips away without warning and every familiar object hides a secret. I've come to believe that these aren't mere coincidences or figments of an overactive imagination. Something far darker and more inexplicable is at work, rewriting the rules of reality around me. I am left with a lingering terror, a fear that I am trapped in a world that appears normal to everyone else, but is unraveling for me, piece by piece, into something I cannot escape. Whether it's a curse, a hidden experiment, or something even more unfathomable, I know one thing with chilling certainty. My life, as I once knew it, is gone forever, and I may never find the answers I so desperately seek. I've always taken comfort in the predictability of my little apartment, a modest one-bedroom in a building that had seen better days, but which I'd come to call home. When I first moved in, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. The creak of the floorboards, the muted hum of the refrigerator, even the way the morning light slanted through the dusty window. But about 3 weeks in, I started to notice small things missing or misplaced. It began with my favorite pen, the one with the worn grip I always left on my desk. One evening, after a long day at work, I reached for it only to find its spot empty. I assumed I had simply set it down somewhere else, but the next day it was back on the desk, exactly where I remembered leaving it, as if it had never been moved at all. Over the following days, the inconsistencies multiplied. I'd come home and find the hallway light dimmer than I'd left it, or a stray postcard on the coffee table that I hadn't seen before. Once, while preparing dinner, I noticed an unfamiliar smudge near the door frame. A subtle scratch, like a tiny handprint pressed against the wood, but with no corresponding mark on my other door frames. At first, I dismissed these as the natural wear of an old building or my own absent-mindedness. But deep down, a slow-growing dread took root. One night, as I sat reading in the living room, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible click coming from the corridor. I paused and listened, certain it had come again the next time I passed by that same spot, even though nothing appeared out of place. Then I began to see it, a pattern shift in the way my furniture was arranged. I distinctly remembered placing my armchair facing the window, yet on the next evening it sat angled toward the door. I would swear that I hadn't touched it. At first, I wondered if I was simply overworked and misremembering the details of my day. But the changes were too consistent, too deliberate. I tried to talk about it with friends, even mentioned it to the building manager, but everyone insisted nothing had changed. "It's an old building," they said. "You're just imagining things." Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. My nightly routine, once a source of comfort, had become punctuated by these small anomalies, like missing keys, an out-of-place cushion, or a door that I was sure I'd locked now left ajar. And then, one evening, a note appeared. I found it tucked under my door in a neat, looping handwriting. Things aren't always as they seem. I was terrified and confused. Yet when I mentioned it to a neighbor, she merely smiled sympathetically and suggested I was stressed. As the weeks wore on, the incidents escalated in a way that left me unable to tell what was real. I began to catch glimpses of shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. I'd step into my kitchen and see the reflection of someone behind me in the stainless steel fridge, a figure that vanished when I spun around. At times, my own reflection in the hallway mirror would lag a split second behind my movements, as if it were on a delayed loop, a copy of me that wasn't quite synchronized with reality. I started to keep a detailed journal, meticulously recording every odd detail. the precise time a light flickered, the exact position of objects that had inexplicably shifted. The more I documented, the more I realized that these events formed a pattern, a subtle, almost imperceptible rewriting of my environment. There were nights when I awoke to find objects I was sure I'd put away suddenly in different places. My keys on the kitchen counter instead of on the hook by the door, a book left open on my desk with pages that had been marked in ink I didn't recognize. Once, while lying in bed, I thought I heard whispering voices, soft murmurs that blended into the sound of the wind outside. But when I turned on the lights, there was nothing but silence. Each anomaly built upon the last, creating an overwhelming sense that my world was being slowly, deliberately altered without my consent. I began to feel increasingly isolated, trapped in a loop where every familiar aspect of my home was subject to inexplicable changes. I questioned whether I was losing my mind or if something far more sinister was at work. At work, I noticed colleagues referencing small details about my day that I couldn't remember. A conversation about a misplaced file or a comment about a coffee spill I swore hadn't happened. Their recollections didn't match mine, as if our shared reality was splitting into two different versions, one that everyone else accepted as normal and one that only I could see. Then, one evening, after coming home to yet another subtle rearrangement, a picture frame that had been perfectly aligned now hanging at an odd angle, I sat down at my computer and reread my journal. The entries detailed a progression from minor inconsistencies to a disturbing pattern that I couldn't ignore. I felt as though I were being watched by an unseen presence, as if every time I returned to my apartment, I stepped into a version of my life that had been slightly edited, rearranged, or even erased. The sense of normalcy I once knew was gone, replaced by a reality that was shifting beneath my feet like sand. Now, as I write these words in the quiet hours of the night, I can't shake the lingering fear that I am not alone in this phenomenon. Each time I close my eyes, I see those faint, deliberate changes. The moved armchair, the altered note, the stray smudge, and I wonder if they are signals from something beyond my understanding. Am I simply a victim of my own fraying sanity? Or is there a greater force at work, methodically rewriting the very fabric of my existence? I have no answers, only the relentless feeling that my reality is no longer fixed, but instead is a mutable construct, a puzzle that no one else can see. The final, haunting thought that grips me is this: if everything around me can change so subtly, so imperceptibly, then what is truly real? I am left to wonder if the world I once trusted is nothing more than an illusion, a carefully curated facade that can be manipulated at any moment. And with every unexplained shift, every object that appears or disappears, I feel the chill of an unknown presence lurking just at the edge of my perception. Whether these events are merely the product of my own troubled mind or evidence of something far more terrifying, I can't shake the thought that I am trapped in a reality that may be slipping away, one that leaves me with more questions than answers, and a deep, abiding sense of unease that will never truly fade. I never imagined that the familiar world I'd grown up with could begin to twist and warp right before my eyes. It started subtly enough, small details that, at first, I chalked up to my own absent-mindedness. I moved into a modest apartment in a quiet part of town about 6 months ago. The building was old but charming, with creaky floors and warm, natural light that poured in through large windows. The first few weeks were uneventful, filled with the comforting routines of daily life. But then, one evening, as I returned from work, I noticed that the photograph of my parents on the hallway wall looked different. The picture itself was the same, a snapshot from my childhood, but the frame, which I distinctly remembered as a rustic wooden one, now appeared to be sleek and modern. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and assumed I must have misremembered it. Still, an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. The next day, while making my morning coffee, I reached for the mug I used every day. It was my favorite mug, a chipped, hand-painted relic that always reminded me of simpler times. To my astonishment, it was missing from its usual spot on the kitchen counter. I searched the apartment and eventually found it, not on the counter, but on the dining table, as if someone had deliberately moved it during the night. I scolded myself for being careless, yet a nagging doubt crept in. I began noticing more oddities. The position of the sofa in the living room, which I had arranged meticulously, seemed slightly altered whenever I returned from an errand. The pattern on the faded rug, which had always been unmistakable, appeared to have shifted, as though someone had stepped on it and left an imprint that wasn't there before. At work, the changes were even more disconcerting. Colleagues I'd known for years started saying things that were out of character. My best friend and co-worker, Laura, who was always warm and chatty, began giving curt, clipped responses and sometimes even a blank stare when I greeted her. During lunch breaks, I overheard conversations where details about shared experiences seemed to conflict with what I remembered. When I mentioned these discrepancies, people laughed it off, saying I was overthinking or that I must have misunderstood. Yet, deep inside, I felt an undeniable shift, a sense that everything was slipping away from what I knew to be true. One particular incident that shook me to my core occurred one rainy evening. I returned home, soaked from the downpour, and found my front door ajar despite being certain I had locked it before leaving. My heart pounded as I crept inside. Nothing appeared amiss at first glance. My belongings were in place, the lights were on, and the usual hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. But then I noticed a series of strange, almost imperceptible marks on the wooden floor near the door. Lines that looked like scratches or even faint symbols etched into the wood. I couldn't recall ever seeing them before. When I called my neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, an elderly man who'd lived in the building for decades, he looked at me as if I were speaking nonsense. "Everything's fine, son," he said, shaking his head and urging me not to worry. But I knew something was terribly wrong. As the weeks passed, these anomalies grew bolder. I began to document every incident in a battered notebook. I wrote down the exact times and details. The misplaced mug, the altered photograph, the inexplicable marks on the floor. I even started taking photos, comparing them from day to day. Yet whenever I showed these to friends or neighbors, they'd examine them briefly and then dismiss them with a smile, insisting that nothing had changed at all. It was as if I was the only one who could see the alterations, the only one trapped in this shifting reality. My sleep was plagued with unsettling dreams. I dreamed of walking down a familiar street, only to see the same storefront repeated over and over, its sign flickering between different names and colors. I dreamed of being in a room where the walls slowly closed in, the furniture rearranging itself in patterns that made no sense. Waking up, I'd be drenched in sweat, my heart hammering as I tried to convince myself that it was just a dream. But then, during the day, I'd catch a glimpse of a scene from one of those nightmares. A hallway with a door that had a number I didn't recognize, or a mirror that reflected a version of myself that looked frightened and confused. The most disturbing change, however, was not in the objects or the layout of my apartment, but in the people around me. Family members and friends who once shared warm, familiar stories began to recount events differently. My sister, whom I'd always trusted to have a clear memory, suddenly recalled details about our childhood that conflicted with my own recollections. Conversations would loop back on themselves, and I found myself questioning whether I had spoken certain words or if someone else had inserted them into our dialogue without my knowledge. It was as if my reality was being subtly rewritten every day, layer by imperceptible layer, and I was the only one who sensed the shift. One night, I decided to confront the situation head-on. I gathered my courage and called a few close friends, demanding to know if they had noticed anything strange lately. They all assured me that everything was as normal as ever, that I was probably overworked and imagining things. I begged them to check my apartment with me, to see if they could spot any differences, but when they entered, their eyes glazed over as if they were seeing nothing out of the ordinary. I felt isolated, marooned in a reality that was steadily becoming alien and hostile. Now, as I sit in the dim light of my apartment with the sounds of the night pressing in, I am consumed by a creeping terror that I might be the only one experiencing this slow, insidious unraveling of my world. Every creak of the floor, every shadow in the corner of my eye, seems to hint at an unseen force at work, a force that is altering everything I once took for granted. I can no longer trust my senses, for they whisper of a truth that no one else seems willing to acknowledge. The changes are real, or so I fear, and they point to a possibility that I can't shake. Perhaps my reality isn't as fixed as it once was, but rather a fragile construct that is being manipulated by forces beyond my control. I lie awake at night, haunted by the thought that with each passing day, I am descending further into a world that looks normal to everyone else but is, in truth, steadily becoming something unrecognizable. I wonder if I'll ever find a way back to the certainty of my old life, or if I am doomed to wander in this twilight zone of shifting memories and altered objects. The questions remain unanswered, and as the silence of the night deepens, so does my dread. Whether it's all in my head or evidence of something far more sinister, one thing is clear. I am trapped in a reality that is slowly but surely slipping away, leaving me to face an ever-growing mystery that may never be solved. I first noticed something was off on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I left my apartment in my usual rush, grabbing my keys and phone without a second thought. But as I walked down the familiar block, I saw a small detail that didn't belong. The green awning of the corner bakery, which had always been red in my memory, now glowed in an unsettling shade of chartreuse. I brushed it off as a simple update or perhaps a trick of the early light, yet a nagging doubt began to fester. Later that day, during my lunch break at the office, I encountered a co-worker I was sure I'd never seen before, a man in a worn leather jacket with eyes that felt strangely familiar. He smiled as he passed me in the corridor, and for a split second, I was convinced I'd seen him somewhere. But when I asked around, everyone insisted that he was new and that I must have mistaken someone else. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. At home that evening, while I was making dinner, I discovered that my favorite mug, the one with the faded red stripes, was not in its usual spot on the shelf. Instead, it sat on the kitchen counter alongside a series of inexplicable scratches etched along its handle. The scratches looked almost deliberate, as if someone had traced a pattern that I couldn't decipher. I reassembled the scene in my mind, trying to recall any reason for the shift, but nothing fit. The more I tried to rationalize it, the more convinced I became that my world was subtly, yet irreversibly, shifting. The next day, the glitches grew bolder. I walked into the lobby of my apartment building and noticed that the bulletin board, which I remembered as cluttered with community notices, had been replaced overnight with a single, sterile sheet of paper that simply read "Update complete." I asked the doorman about it, but he just shrugged and said everything was normal. It was as if the change was invisible to everyone else, leaving me alone in a reality that was slowly rewriting itself. At work, the pattern continued. In meetings, colleagues repeated phrases I distinctly remembered uttering just moments before, as if my own words were being looped back to me by a hidden playback device. Conversations began to feel disjointed, as if time were stuttering. One moment, a discussion flowed naturally, and the next, it reset, erasing details and replacing them with subtly altered versions of what had just been said. I documented these occurrences meticulously, jotting down times, phrases, and even taking discrete photos of altered office displays. But whenever I brought up my findings, my coworkers smiled politely and dismissed it as stress or my imagination playing tricks. One night, I returned home and found my apartment door slightly ajar, despite being absolutely sure I had locked it. Inside, things weren't as I'd left them. A cushion had been moved from the sofa to the floor, and the pattern on the rug, one I had memorized since childhood, seemed to have changed its design ever so slightly. I searched for any signs of forced entry or a break-in, but there was nothing, only the disconcerting evidence that my environment was being subtly reconfigured. Then came the day that shattered any remnants of certainty. I was out for a walk in a park I had frequented for years when I suddenly encountered a man I recognized. A man who I was convinced was my childhood friend, though he had died nearly a decade ago. He was sitting on a bench, smiling wistfully as he fed the birds. I froze, my heart pounding in disbelief. I approached him, desperate for an explanation, but as soon as I was close enough, he vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a faint scent of cologne and a lingering echo of his laughter. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to piece together whether I had truly seen him or if my mind was playing the cruelest of tricks. As the glitches multiplied, the very fabric of my reality began to blur. Everyday objects rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking. Streets I had known all my life seemed to shift their routes. And even the weather appeared to reset mid-afternoon, as if someone had hit an invisible refresh button on the day. I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, immersing myself in routine and forcing myself to ignore the growing tide of inconsistency. But every time I closed my eyes, I could still see that inexplicable green awning, hear the looping echoes of conversations, and feel the prickling sensation that I was no longer in control of my own memories. Eventually, I realized that the pattern was no random coincidence. Each glitch felt like a deliberate edit, a minor revision in a script I had once known by heart. I began to suspect that I was caught in a cascade of errors, a broken simulation where every detail of my life was subject to rewriting. I turned to online forums for solace, discovering others who described similar experiences. Familiar places that looked different upon repeated visits, time gaps that left them disoriented, and the unnerving feeling that the world was on the verge of a permanent reset. Yet, no one had a definitive explanation. Most simply accepted that they were living in a glitching reality, a state that might never fully revert to what it once was. One crisp autumn evening, as I sat alone in my dimly lit living room reviewing my notes, a moment of final clarity struck me. I watched a video I had recorded on my phone, a recording of a conversation in the hallway where, for an instant, I had caught a glimpse of my own reflection in a window that should have been facing the street. But it wasn't my reflection at all. It was a stranger, someone I did not recognize, standing behind me, smiling in a way that sent shivers down my spine. The recording stuttered, looping that brief, impossible moment over and over until I shut the camera off. In that moment, I knew with bone-deep certainty that the world I inhabited was not stable. The glitches were not mere errors to be fixed. They were evolving, expanding, and altering everything around me. Now, as I write these words in the fading light of dusk, I am overwhelmed by the realization that I may never return to a normal, predictable reality. The glitches have become so pervasive that the line between what is real and what is manipulated has dissolved entirely. I can no longer trust my eyes, my memories, or even the steady tick of the clock. I have become a part of the glitch, a living, breathing anomaly in a world that continues to rewrite itself with every passing moment. Every day, I live with the disconcerting knowledge that my life is now a series of revisions in a broken system, and that perhaps, somewhere deep down, I have lost the chance to ever experience the world as it once was. I met him on a rainy Thursday afternoon, one of those days when the sky seems to weep quietly over the city. I was hurrying through the subway station when I noticed a man standing near the ticket booth. He wore a dark coat and a hat pulled low over his eyes. Something about his stillness and the way he regarded the bustling crowd caught my attention. I nodded a casual greeting as I passed, and he returned a slight, almost imperceptible smile. I didn't think much of it at the time, a brief encounter in an otherwise ordinary day. The following week, subtle changes began to creep into my life. I started missing chunks of time, as if the hours were evaporating into thin air. One evening, after leaving a late meeting at work, I distinctly recall entering my apartment, only to find the clock reading nearly 2 hours later than I expected. I tried to piece together what I'd been doing, but my mind was blank. At first, I assumed I was simply exhausted, perhaps dozing off for a few minutes. But then, in the corridors of my apartment building, I began noticing that people I had met earlier in the day seemed slightly different. The receptionist, whom I'd chatted with about the weather, now spoke in a tone that was oddly detached, as if she had rehearsed her lines before speaking. The strangest part was the recurring presence of the man from the subway. I began to see him in places where I shouldn't. One morning, while waiting for my bus, I saw him leaning against a lamppost, his coat dark against the drizzly backdrop. When I crossed the street, I caught a glimpse of his reflection in a storefront window, but his hat and the tilt of his head had shifted ever so slightly. Was it the same man? I couldn't be sure. His appearance seemed to subtly change from one encounter to the next. Sometimes his eyes appeared brighter. Other times his smile was wider, as if he were experimenting with different expressions. As the days went by, these glitches grew bolder. I'd walk into a familiar cafe, and the arrangement of the tables would be off. Chairs placed in spots where I distinctly remembered them being empty the previous day. On one occasion, while browsing a bookstore I'd visited countless times, I found a section rearranged so that books were ordered by color rather than title. The store manager offered no explanation, merely a polite shrug when I mentioned it. I began to wonder if I was losing my grip on reality, but the changes were too precise, too consistent to be random. The man in the dark coat began to follow me more frequently. I'd catch him across busy intersections, outside office buildings, and sometimes even in the reflection of a car window. He never spoke, yet his silent presence made me question if I was being drawn into something larger than myself. At work, I experienced another anomaly. During a routine meeting, I recalled mentioning a project detail, only to have a colleague reiterate it word for word moments later, as if echoing my own thoughts. That same colleague, normally a vibrant presence, appeared subdued, as if he were mimicking what he thought I expected him to say. The entire conversation felt like a rehearsal, a looped fragment that I couldn't escape. Then one evening, I found myself at a local park, sitting on a bench and watching the sunset. As the sky deepened into a spectrum of oranges and purples, I noticed the man again, sitting a few benches away. I thought about approaching him, about asking who he was and why I kept seeing him, but the idea evaporated as I watched the same group of children playing repetitively in a corner, their laughter eerily synchronized. I glanced at my watch and realized that I couldn't remember how long I had been there. The minutes seemed to blur together, as if time itself had been edited. At home, things continued to unravel in ways I couldn't explain. I started finding objects in different places. A book on my coffee table that I was certain I had left on my nightstand, or a photograph that looked slightly altered from the version I remembered. Even my own memories began to show signs of distortion. I would recall a conversation with a friend only to find that, upon recounting it, the details didn't match. The friend insisted nothing had changed, that I was mistaken. Yet, deep down, I felt a quiet but insistent tug, as if some unseen hand was rewriting the script of my life. One night, I sat alone in my apartment, trying to make sense of the mounting anomalies. I replayed the day's events in my mind, the shifting faces of strangers, the lost hours, the inexplicable rearrangements. I realized with a sinking dread that the glitches were not confined to isolated incidents. They were infiltrating every facet of my reality. I opened my journal, filled with scribbled notes and hastily drawn diagrams, and I began to see a pattern. Every time I encountered that man, every unexplained moment, it was as if reality had momentarily faltered, revealing a fissure in the fabric of my world. I started questioning if I was even in control anymore. Was I the one experiencing these glitches, or had I become part of them? The more I scrutinized the details, the more I felt like I was caught in an endless loop, a simulation that kept updating itself, erasing the past and altering the present with every unnoticed moment. My own identity began to feel mutable, as if the essence of who I was subject to the same erratic editing that plagued my environment. Now, as I sit in the dim light of my apartment, the world around me feels increasingly unfamiliar. The man in the dark coat appears less like a stranger and more like a constant reminder that something is fundamentally broken. I have come to accept that the reality I once trusted, one that was solid and predictable, may have been nothing more than an illusion, a facade built upon layers of code and coincidences. Each day, as I navigate through these glitches, I feel more entangled in a narrative that isn't entirely mine. I have become part of the anomaly, a character in a story that is rewriting itself without my consent. And as I stare at the ever-changing skyline through my window, I am left with the inescapable truth. The world I knew is gone, replaced by a glitching simulation that I can no longer escape, where every moment is a reminder that nothing is as it seems. I moved into my new apartment in early November, excited by the promise of a fresh start in a place that, at first glance, was perfectly ordinary. The building was old but charming. Creaky hardwood floors, sunlit windows, and a warm, almost homely atmosphere. I spent the first few days unpacking and arranging my belongings exactly the way I wanted. Everything was exactly as I'd planned, or so I thought. It started with small things. One evening after a long day at work, I returned home and noticed that my favorite ceramic mug, a piece with faded blue stripes that I always kept on the table by the doorway, had been moved to the kitchen counter. I distinctly remembered leaving it exactly where it was. I tried to dismiss the incident as a simple mistake on my part, perhaps a lapse in memory due to exhaustion. But the next morning, the mug was back on the table, just as I had arranged it the night before. At first, I thought it was a fluke, but then more subtle changes began to occur. Within a week, I started to notice that familiar objects weren't quite where I expected them. The bookshelf I had meticulously organized one day would be slightly different the next. Books were in a new order, and a few volumes were missing only to reappear later in places I didn't recall choosing. One day, I found a small, folded note tucked beneath the door. In elegant handwriting, it simply read, "Not everything stays the same." I asked the building manager if anyone else had reported such oddities, but he shrugged it off as nothing more than an overactive imagination on my part. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, that the changes were coincidences or tricks of a tired mind. But then the anomalies grew bolder. I returned home one night to find the living room arranged differently. The sofa was turned to face the window instead of the door, and a painting that I had hung for months was now leaning against the wall in the hallway. I checked every room. Nothing appeared broken or disturbed, only subtly altered. I even noticed that the digital clock on the wall seemed to skip a few minutes at random intervals, as if time itself were being tampered with. One evening, I sat in my living room reading when I heard a soft rustling sound coming from the corridor. I paused the book and listened. The sound recurred intermittently, almost like footsteps, though I knew I was alone. I peered through the peephole and saw nothing out of the ordinary, only the familiar, dimly lit hallway. Yet, when I returned to my room, I found a single white glove lying on the floor near the door. I had no gloves, and none had ever been here before. My heart pounded as I picked it up, feeling as if an unseen presence had left it deliberately. The strangest part was how these changes repeated. I began documenting every anomaly in a worn notebook. Notes on misplaced objects, altered furniture, and even the occasional cryptic message that appeared on scraps of paper I found in unexpected places. Every entry was meticulous, and yet, no matter how many times I recorded the same scene, the details continued to shift subtly. I took photos comparing one day to the next. In one shot, a lamp that I was sure had been on the side table was now on a nearby shelf. In another, a framed photograph hung slightly crooked when I remembered it being perfectly aligned. I tried to share my findings with friends, but they only offered sympathetic smiles and reassurances that my apartment looked the same as ever. Even my closest neighbor insisted that nothing had changed. As much as I wanted to believe them, the evidence in my own eyes was undeniable. I started to feel that perhaps the apartment itself was caught in some kind of inexplicable loop, a closed system where reality was constantly being rewritten, even as I remained unaware of the orchestrator behind it. One night, after another long day of minor but disconcerting shifts, I returned to my apartment only to be struck by a chilling realization. I remembered turning off the hallway light before leaving, but upon my return, the light was already off. I retraced my steps, only to find that everything had been reset to a state that I could have sworn I had altered earlier that day. It was as if the passage of time itself was folding back on my actions. The sensation was unsettling, a growing certainty that I was trapped in an alternate version of my own reality, one where nothing remained constant. The more I observed, the more I began to doubt whether these changes were happening externally or were figments of my imagination. But the physical evidence, the rearranged furniture, the mysterious note, the unexplained white glove, told a story that was all too real. I started to question if I had somehow stepped into a closed loop, an alternate reality where the familiar became alien and every detail was subject to inexplicable alteration. Now, as I sit alone in this apartment that once felt like a sanctuary, but now feels like a shifting maze, I can no longer trust my senses. The world around me has become a series of edits, revisions that occur when I'm not looking. Every time I return to a place, I know it will be different, changed in ways both minute and profound. I am left with a deep, gnawing fear that my reality is not as fixed as it once seemed, that I have unwittingly stepped into an endless loop where nothing is truly permanent. I don't know if I will ever be able to reclaim the stability I once had, or if I am doomed to live in this strange, mutable space, forever questioning whether the life I remember is even real. I always thought my life was ordinary until that fateful night shattered everything I believed in. It began on a seemingly normal evening when I returned home after a late shift. My apartment, a modest space in an old building with creaky floors and drafty windows, had always been a sanctuary. But that night, something was off. I distinctly remembered locking the door, yet when I reached for my keys, the door was slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat as I hesitated before pushing it open. I assumed I'd simply been distracted, perhaps misremembering the exact moment I locked up, and I stepped inside. The air felt heavier than usual, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. Over the next few days, small anomalies began to pile up, each more unsettling than the last. I'd leave for work with a renewed sense of security, only to return home to find minor items out of place. A book on a shelf where I hadn't left it, a mug that had moved from the kitchen counter to the living room table. At first, I dismissed these occurrences as the result of my own absent-mindedness. But then I began hearing faint, unexplained noises in the dead of night. Soft whispers that melted into the hum of the refrigerator, creaks that weren't the settling of an old building, and, sometimes, the distinct sound of footsteps pacing just outside my bedroom door. One night, I awoke to the sound of a knock, firm and deliberate, at my front door. My pulse raced as I peered through the peephole. In the dim hallway light, I saw a face that was blurred by the darkness. It was neither clearly male nor female, with eyes that seemed to bore into mine. I couldn't recall ever meeting that person, yet there was a familiarity that made my skin crawl. I refused to open the door. Instead, I listened, my breath shallow, as the knocking slowly faded into silence. The next morning, on my doorstep, I found a small handwritten note in neat, deliberate script. I know what you fear. I couldn't fathom who could have left it or why, but the implication was inescapable. As days turned to weeks, the disturbances grew in intensity and frequency. The soft whispers evolved into audible murmurs that echoed through empty rooms. I began noticing that my personal belongings were being inexplicably rearranged. My journal, where I recorded every odd occurrence, appeared with pages out of order, as if someone had rifled through it and then returned it, leaving subtle smudges on the paper. My computer would inexplicably power on late at night, displaying fleeting images of a dark figure standing behind me before shutting off abruptly. Each instance was small on its own, but together they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. I was not alone in my home. I tried to find a rational explanation. Perhaps I was overworked and letting my imagination run wild in the silence of the night. I even installed a small camera near my front door, convinced that I would catch a glimpse of an intruder. When I reviewed the footage, I saw nothing unusual, only empty hallways and the flicker of old fluorescent lights. Yet the feeling of being observed grew stronger every time I closed my eyes. Sleep became a luxury, and every creak or gust of wind left me jumping in terror. I found myself double-checking locks and peering through curtains, desperate for reassurance that I was safe, yet nothing could dispel the dread that had seeped into every corner of my life. Desperate for answers, I reached out to a local historian who specialized in the building's past. He hesitated before confessing that the apartment building had a troubled history. Stories of previous tenants disappearing under mysterious circumstances, strange occurrences that local residents whispered about but never fully explained. According to him, the building had once been part of a larger estate rumored to have been cursed following a series of tragic events. I wanted to believe it was nothing more than folklore, yet the timing of these revelations coincided eerily with the onset of my own experiences. One particularly harrowing night, after a restless day filled with anxious waiting and sleepless hours, I heard a clear, deliberate voice calling my name from somewhere within my apartment. It wasn't a sound that technology or animals could produce. It was distinctly human, layered with an emotion I couldn't quite place, an urgency laced with malice. I followed the voice down the hallway, heart pounding, until I reached the living room. There, in the mirror hanging above the mantel, I saw a shadow behind me, a figure that wasn't present when I turned around. I swear I could feel cold, unseen eyes tracking my every move, and in that moment, I knew there was no rational explanation that could allay the terror coursing through my veins. Now, even as I write this, I am haunted by the unyielding certainty that something inhuman lurks just beyond the veil of my everyday life. Every creak, every whisper, every inexplicable rearrangement of my belongings is a reminder that I am not alone, that I have been marked by an unseen presence. The note, the blurred face at the door, the relentless feeling of being watched, they all demand an answer I may never receive. There is no logical explanation, no scientific rationale that can account for what I experienced. I know it was real because I lived through it. I was forced to confront a terror that defies reason and explanation. And so, I leave you with the unsettling truth. Sometimes, the inexplicable invades your life without warning, leaving you with scars that no amount of logic can heal. This was real, this was terrifying, and the question that continues to haunt me is why. I always prided myself on being in control of my life, on knowing exactly what I was doing at any given moment. That certainty began to crumble one cool autumn evening when I returned home from work. I distinctly remember locking the front door, yet when I stepped inside, I felt a disquiet that I couldn't explain. The lights were on, the familiar hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, and everything seemed normal, except that I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, as if a part of me had been missing. At first, it was just a fleeting sensation. I began to notice small gaps in my memory. I'd be in the middle of a conversation with a friend, only to later struggle to recall exactly what I'd said. One morning, I found that I had left a cup of coffee on the table, but when I went to retrieve it later, it was cold and untouched, as if I had never drunk it at all. I chalked it up to fatigue, to the stress of long hours at work. But then more disturbing signs emerged. I started to feel that time was slipping away from me. There were nights when I'd wake up with a deep sense of disorientation, unable to remember how long I had been asleep. I'd glance at my clock, and the numbers would sometimes seem to jump, skipping minutes or even hours that I couldn't account for. I began to document these episodes in a journal, noting the exact times and details of what I remembered, but every entry felt more incomplete than the last. It was as if my life was being edited in real time, with parts erased before I could even comprehend them. What terrified me most wasn't just the loss of time, but the subtle changes in my behavior that I couldn't explain. One afternoon, I caught a glimpse of myself in a shop window. I was walking down the street, and for a brief moment, I saw my reflection smiling, when I knew I wasn't. Later, a friend told me I had been unusually cheerful and outgoing at a party, recounting stories and jokes I had no recollection of ever making. I started questioning whether these moments were my own actions or if someone or something was controlling them from within me. It was as if I were merely a puppet, with an unseen hand guiding my movements and words, leaving me to wonder if I was still the one pulling the strings. At work, my colleagues began to change too. Conversations would veer off in directions I didn't remember initiating, and people I'd known for years started acting as if they shared different memories of our past interactions. I brought it up with one coworker, asking if he recalled a particular conversation from the previous day. He looked at me puzzled and said, "I don't remember that happening. Are you sure you didn't imagine it?" His denial made me feel even more isolated, like I was trapped in a reality that everyone else took for granted, except me. Late one night, as I sat in my dimly lit living room, trying to piece together the fragments of my scattered memories, I began to notice something even more unsettling. I found a series of small, cryptic notes tucked into random places. A slip of paper under my pillow, a message on the back of a receipt from a corner store. Each note contained a single sentence. "You are not alone. Control is an illusion. They watch from within." The handwriting was unfamiliar, and no matter how many times I questioned myself, I couldn't recall writing them or even how they got there. I considered the possibility that I was fabricating these occurrences in my mind, that stress and sleep deprivation were playing cruel tricks on me. But the physical evidence was undeniable. I started to feel as if there were two versions of myself. One that the world saw, composed of habitual gestures and predictable words, and another lurking in the shadows, acting independently with memories that weren't my own. I would catch fleeting images of this second self out of the corner of my eye. A figure moving silently in the dark hallways of my apartment building. A smile that wasn't mine reflected in a window. In the quiet moments before sleep, I felt an overwhelming sensation of being watched, not by an external presence, but by the very essence of my own mind, as if it were scrutinizing every decision, every forgotten moment. Desperate for answers, I sought help from a therapist and confided my experiences. She listened with a sympathetic expression, suggesting that perhaps I was suffering from extreme stress or a dissociative disorder. But while her words were meant to comfort, they only deepened my isolation. I wasn't losing my grip on reality. I knew every detail of what was happening, yet no one else could see the changes. My life felt like a series of manipulated scenes in a film where I was both actor and audience, trapped in a loop where control was an illusion. Now, as I sit alone in the silence of the night, the feeling of being manipulated from within never leaves me. Every time I try to recall my actions, I sense gaps in my memory that hint at events I cannot fully comprehend. I feel as though an unseen force is rewriting the script of my life, erasing moments, altering words, and guiding my behavior without my consent. I have no concrete answers, no definitive proof that something external is controlling me, yet the persistent dread remains, a chill that whispers I am not truly free. Whether these phenomena are the product of a fractured mind or evidence of something far more sinister, I cannot shake the feeling that I am forever under surveillance, that my actions are being dictated by a force lurking within, just beyond the edge of perception. And so, I lie awake in the darkness, haunted by the thought that even if I could reclaim control, I might never again be the master of my own destiny. I moved into my new apartment a few months ago, a small but comfortable one-bedroom on the edge of town. The place wasn't perfect. Thin walls, flickering hallway lights, and the occasional creak from the old plumbing, but it was mine. At first, everything was normal. My neighbors were polite, but distant, the kind of people who nodded in passing, but never stopped to chat. That was fine with me. I like my privacy. Then I met her. It was a late evening when I was bringing groceries up to my floor. As I rounded the last flight of stairs, I nearly bumped into a woman standing just outside my apartment door. She was staring at it, her fingers grazing the doorknob as if she was about to open it. I froze. She turned, startled, and immediately broke into a bright smile. "Oh, I'm sorry, I thought this was my friend's place," she said quickly. "I must have the wrong floor." Something about her excuse felt off. This building only had 6 apartments per floor, and the numbers were clearly marked. Still, I didn't want to be rude, so I gave a polite nod and unlocked my door. She lingered a second longer before walking away, her heels clicking softly down the hall. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that she had been lying. The way her hand had rested on my doorknob wasn't the action of someone casually lost. It was deliberate, too familiar. Over the next week, I started seeing her more often. In the laundry room, at the mailbox, even in the small convenience store across the street. Each time, she greeted me warmly, acting as though we were old acquaintances. She asked small, probing questions. "Do you live alone? What hours do you usually work? Have you met the other tenants?" Always delivered with an easy, friendly smile. One night, I came home late from work and noticed my apartment door was slightly ajar. My stomach clenched. I was absolutely sure I had locked it before leaving. I stood there for a long moment, listening. The air inside was still, silent. After a deep breath, I pushed the door open and flipped on the lights. Nothing seemed out of place. My belongings were all there. No signs of forced entry. I checked every room, even the closets, but I found nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my gut. I convinced myself that maybe I had been careless, left it unlocked by accident. But I started double-checking every time I left after that. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of soft scratching. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but definitely coming from the other side of my front door. I held my breath, my pulse hammering. Someone was there, listening, waiting. I sat up, trying to make out any shadows beneath the door, but the sound stopped abruptly. Minutes passed, then an hour. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I opened my door to find something wedged underneath it. A folded piece of paper. My hands shook as I opened it. "I like watching you." That was it. Just 5 words scrawled in uneven handwriting. I immediately reported it to the building manager, but he was dismissive. "Probably some kid playing a prank," he said with a shrug. "We don't have security cameras in the hallways, so there's not much we can do." That night, I installed my own camera above my door, a cheap motion-activated one. I felt safer knowing that if anything happened again, at least I'd have proof. The footage from the first 2 nights was uneventful. Just me coming and going, the occasional neighbor passing by. But on the 3rd night, my blood ran cold. At 2:13 a.m., movement triggered the camera. A figure appeared just at the edge of the frame. The woman. She stood in front of my door, perfectly still, staring at it for almost 10 minutes. She didn't knock, didn't move, just stood there. Then, slowly, she reached out and ran her fingers down the surface of my door, gently, like she was memorizing it. Then she turned, looking directly at the camera. Her face remained expressionless, but her lips parted slightly, as if whispering something. There was no sound, no words I could make out. She lingered another moment before walking away. I barely slept after that. The next morning, I went straight to the building manager again, demanding answers. I told him I had footage, but when I tried to pull up the file, it was gone. My camera had recorded everything, but the file had been corrupted, replaced with static. I felt trapped in a nightmare that no one else could see. No one believed me. I started noticing more things, small, almost imperceptible changes in my apartment. A chair slightly moved from where I left it. My toothbrush damp when I hadn't used it. My closet door left open an inch when I always kept it shut. I began locking my bedroom door at night, a heavy chair wedged under the handle. The final straw came 3 nights ago. I was dozing off when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of my front door unlocking. I shot up, heart slamming against my ribs. I knew I had locked it. I knew I had. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering to the operator that someone was in my apartment. The silence stretched on. I strained to hear footsteps, breathing, anything. Then, soft as a sigh, I heard a voice, right outside my bedroom door. "I told you. I like watching you." I don't remember much after that. Just the sound of my own breathing, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped my phone. I stayed frozen until the police arrived. When they searched my apartment, they found nothing. The locks were intact, no sign of forced entry. But I knew what I heard. I knew someone had been inside. I packed a bag that night and left. I haven't gone back since. I broke my lease, moved across the city, and changed my number. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that she's still watching. That one day, I'll look over my shoulder and see her again, smiling, waiting. I've always believed that the world around me was unchanging, a solid, dependable background to my daily life. That was until small discrepancies began to surface, almost imperceptibly at first, and then with a growing insistence that left me questioning everything I thought I knew. It started with the simplest of observations. On a Monday morning, while making coffee in my apartment, I noticed that the mug I always used, with its faded blue pattern, was replaced by an identical one with a slightly different shade of blue. I shrugged it off, thinking I must have grabbed it by mistake from a cupboard, but deep down, a cold unease started to settle in. Over the next few days, other things changed. I walked into my living room and saw the framed photograph of my family on the mantel, but something was off. My younger sister's smile seemed forced, as if she were hiding a secret. The painting on the wall, which I had admired for years, now had an extra brushstroke, almost as if someone had tampered with it while I wasn't looking. I asked myself, am I imagining things? Yet every time I returned to these places, the differences were there, undeniable and growing more unsettling. At work, the situation became even stranger. Colleagues who had been my closest friends for years began to say things I had never heard before. Mark, my supervisor, congratulated me on a project I had no recollection of even starting. And Linda, who always joked with me about our weekend plans, now spoke with an odd formality. When I brought up these changes, they laughed it off as if I were overreacting. Maybe you're just stressed, one of them said, but their eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite decipher, an eerie indifference as if my confusion was expected. Then there were the moments when I was alone. Walking home, one evening along a familiar street, I noticed a shop I'd frequented for years now had a different name and logo. The storefront was the same, the display unchanged, yet the sign above the door was entirely new, and the smell emanating from inside was unfamiliar, sharp and unsettling. I stopped, staring, half expecting to see someone waving a new menu at me, but the window remained blank. I hurried on, heart pounding, but the nagging feeling that reality was slipping away never left me. At first, I tried to document everything. I took photos of the altered mug, the changed photograph, even the new sign on the shop. But when I showed these images to friends and family, they shook their heads in disbelief. It's the same as it's always been, they insisted, dismissing my concerns as stress-induced illusions. Yet the photographs, when examined closely, did show subtle differences, a slightly off hue here, a minuscule change in expression there. I began to wonder if I was the only one who could perceive these alterations, if I were trapped in a reality that was morphing without anyone else's awareness. Sleep brought no relief. Every night, I awoke with a nagging sense that I had lost time, that I had missed entire chunks of my day. I'd find my calendar filled with scribbled notes and appointments I had no memory of scheduling. Even more disturbingly, I began to catch fleeting glimpses of myself in mirrors. A version of me with a tired smile and eyes that looked far older than I felt. Sometimes, that reflection would move a fraction of a second after I did, as if lagging behind, or sometimes it would not move at all, frozen in an expression of silent dread. Desperation led me to seek help. I called my best friend, explained the uncanny changes and the feeling of being constantly watched by an unseen force manipulating my every moment. But when I described the altered photographs, the changed storefront, even the odd behavior at work, she looked at me with pity and concern. Maybe you're overthinking it, she said, urging me to see a doctor. But deep down, I knew it wasn't my mind playing tricks on me, at least not entirely. One evening, as I sat alone in my dimly lit living room, I realized the final, terrifying truth. The very air around me seemed to shift. Shadows lengthened unnaturally on the wall, and the familiar hum of the refrigerator became a low, almost rhythmic pulse. I stood frozen, feeling as if I were encased in a bubble that was slowly deforming, twisting reality into something foreign and hostile. It was then that I understood I wasn't merely witnessing changes. I was being altered by them. My thoughts, my actions, even my memories were at risk of being overwritten by an invisible, malevolent force. I don't know how many days have passed since that realization. Every time I try to anchor myself in what I once knew as normal, I find another inconsistency. A friend's smile that doesn't reach their eyes, a street sign that seems to change its lettering before my eyes, the subtle shift of colors in a landscape that should be immutable. I am left isolated in a world that looks the same to everyone else. Yet to me, it has become an alien and hostile place where nothing can be trusted. Now, as I write these words, I am haunted by the lingering terror that I may never fully understand what is happening. Every familiar face, Every well-known landmark carries a secret that only I can perceive. And the worst part is this: even if I could prove it, who would believe me? I fear that I am trapped in a reality where the rules have changed, manipulated by something beyond my control, and I'm left to wonder if I will ever be free, or if I'm doomed to watch as the world I once knew crumbles into something unrecognizable. I always prided myself on having a steady, predictable routine. Every morning, I'd wake up at 7, brew a fresh pot of coffee, and head to work with the assurance that nothing would disturb the rhythm of my day. That all changed one seemingly ordinary afternoon when I returned home from the office. I opened my front door and, as usual, my favorite ceramic mug sat neatly on the table by the doorway. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was exactly as I had left it the previous evening. But later that night, while I was in the living room reading, I glanced over at the table again. The mug was still there, identical in every detail. I found it odd, since I knew I hadn't touched it, yet I brushed it off as a comforting sign of routine. The next day, as I left for work, I noticed something even stranger. While driving down my usual route, I passed a silver sedan parked on the curb. I distinctly remembered that car not being there during my drive this morning. I stopped at a red light and looked around. The car was still there, exactly where I had seen it. Later, while walking into the building's lobby, I swore I saw the same car reflected in the glass doors, as if it were following me, though I knew it couldn't possibly be in two places at once. My mind began to wonder if I was losing focus, but the nagging unease persisted. As days turned into weeks, these small, inexplicable details started to pile up. At work, I began noticing repetitive patterns that defied logic. During meetings, I would mention a point only to have a colleague echo it moments later, as if my words had already been programmed into the conversation. I would step into the break room, and the exact same arrangement of cups and plates would greet me, no matter how many times I rearranged them. Even the digital clock on my computer seemed to stutter occasionally, as if it were skipping a few seconds, then catching up in an instant. The real turning point came one evening when I returned home and, after a long day, settled into my favorite chair to watch TV. I distinctly recalled turning off the lights in the hallway before starting my show. A few minutes in, I paused the program and headed towards the hallway, only to find the light switch already off. I turned it back on, then off, trying to reconcile the memory of having done it earlier. I began to wonder if I was trapped in some kind of loop, an error in the sequence of events. My heart raced as I tried to anchor myself to facts, but the evidence was slipping through my fingers like smoke. It wasn't just the environment that was affected. I started experiencing a disturbing dissonance in my own memories. Conversations I was certain I had just had would later resurface with subtle differences, like an echo that wasn't quite right. My recollections of the day seemed to fracture into overlapping timelines. One version where everything was exactly as expected, and another where minute details were different, as if reality had been edited. At first, I attributed these inconsistencies to stress or exhaustion, but as the anomalies grew more persistent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something much larger was at work. One afternoon, while I was walking home from a quick errand, I noticed a peculiar sight. I passed by a small park and saw a man sitting on a bench reading a newspaper. The way he sat, the tilt of his head, even the way his hand turned the page, all of it struck me as strangely familiar. I stopped to greet him, only to realize that when I approached, he stood up and started walking away. I followed, desperate for an explanation, but he vanished around a corner. In that moment, I felt a chill run down my spine. Had I really seen him, or was it just another fragment of a reality that kept rewriting itself? Over time, the repetition of these glitches began to feel like part of an elaborate system, one in which I was no longer just an observer. Every day, I noticed subtle edits in the world around me. The same coffee mug would appear in the same spot every evening, not because I left it there intentionally, but because it was as if it were a fixture in a scene I had seen before. The same car, the same man in the park, even the exact phrasing of casual conversations began to loop in a way that defied ordinary explanation. I started keeping a detailed journal, meticulously recording each odd event, hoping to find a pattern or a logical explanation. The more I wrote, the more I realized that the glitches were not isolated incidents, but interconnected threads in a tapestry I couldn't unravel. Late one night, as I sat alone in my apartment surrounded by my scribbled notes and photographs of the anomalies, a disturbing thought began to crystallize in my mind. What if reality itself were fake? What if everything I had known, the steady, reliable flow of time, the uniqueness of each moment, was nothing more than a programmed sequence, repeatedly edited and rewritten without my consent? The thought gnawed at me, blurring the line between my own memories and the manipulated details that now defined my world. I began to question whether I had ever truly experienced anything genuine at all, or if I was simply a character trapped in an endless loop of glitches. The familiar became foreign. The mundane transformed into a recurring motif of cosmic errors. I felt both disoriented and strangely complicit, as if I had become part of a vast simulation, one where the rules of time and space were arbitrary, and my life was nothing more than lines of code in a system beyond my understanding. Now, as I write this, I'm confronted with the possibility that there may be no going back to the world I once knew. The glitches persist, and every day feels like an iteration of a reality that is continuously being rewritten. I can't tell if it even matters anymore, if the feeling of déjà vu, the misplaced objects, and the recurring faces are simply a reflection of my own consciousness or evidence of something far more sinister. The thought lingers. Perhaps my entire existence is just an illusion, a programmed narrative in a world that is designed to repeat itself. And in that realization, I am left with a chilling sense of resignation, wondering if I have ever truly been in control, or if I've always been just another variable in a glitching matrix. I first noticed him on a drizzly autumn afternoon while waiting in line at my favorite corner cafe. I was buried in my thoughts over a lukewarm cup of coffee when I glanced up to see a man I didn't recognize standing just outside the window. He was casually dressed, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses even on a cloudy day, and he offered a slight nod before disappearing into the busy street. At the time, I dismissed it as nothing more than an odd coincidence, a random stranger among many on a typical day. Over the next week, however, little signs began to pile up. On my morning commute, while walking to work along a tree-lined avenue, I caught a glimpse of the same man through the rearview mirror of a passing car. His face was partially obscured by a hood, but there was something disturbingly familiar about his stance, as if he were waiting just for me. I told myself it was mere chance, a trick of the light and my own tired mind. Yet, as the days passed, my initial dismissal was slowly replaced by a growing sense of unease. One evening after a late meeting, I was riding the bus home when I saw him again, sitting silently near the back, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the window. I couldn't see his face clearly, but the feeling that he was watching me prickled under my skin. When I looked around, I realized no one else seemed to notice him. I tried to shake off the discomfort, attributing it to overactive imagination and the strain of long workdays. But every time I left the bus stop or passed a familiar street, there he was, a quiet observer lingering in the background. The situation escalated one rainy night as I was hurrying home from a friend's small get-together. I took a shortcut through a narrow alley, hoping to beat the downpour. Halfway through, I heard footsteps behind me that matched my pace perfectly. I turned, heart hammering, and saw him standing under a flickering street lamp, partially hidden by the falling rain. He raised a hand in a casual greeting, as if we were acquaintances sharing a secret joke. "Evening," he said in a calm, almost friendly tone, before offering a smile that never quite reached his eyes. I mumbled a quick response and increased my pace, unable to decide whether his behavior was intentionally menacing or simply bizarrely coincidental. In the following days, his appearances became harder to ignore. I found subtle signs that he might be following me. A newspaper left open on a park bench with a page bookmarked by a stray coffee stain, a receipt from a store I'd visited the day before tucked into my mailbox, and even a faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air after I'd stepped out of an elevator. Each encounter left me more unsettled than the last, as if I were caught in a loop of my own life, being quietly observed by someone with an unknown agenda. Emotionally, the experience began to erode my sense of security. I started second-guessing my every move, choosing different routes, altering my daily schedule, and even changing my wardrobe, all in the desperate hope of evading him. Friends noticed my growing anxiety and asked if everything was all right, but I couldn't bring myself to reveal the inexplicable presence that haunted my every step. Their skepticism, while perhaps well-intentioned, only deepened my isolation. I felt trapped in a reality where the line between coincidence and conspiracy blurred with every passing day. At work, the discomfort grew even more intense. I began to suspect that his sightings weren't limited to my personal time. Sometimes, when I glanced out of the window during breaks, I would see him standing across the street, as if waiting for a cue. One afternoon, during a particularly quiet moment in the office, I received a text message from an unknown number that simply read, "I'm closer than you think." Panic surged through me, and I immediately reported it to security, only to be met with reassurances that it was probably a prank. But deep down, I knew that wasn't enough to explain the unnerving series of events. Every night, as I lay awake in bed, the thought that I might be under constant surveillance became an inescapable terror. I'd scour the dark corners of my apartment for any sign that he might have slipped in, only to find everything in its proper place, except for the lingering sensation of being watched. I began to question my own sanity, wondering if the stress had conjured up a figment of my imagination. But then there were the small details, a misplaced mug here, a rearranged set of keys there, that I couldn't ignore. It was as if he was deliberately orchestrating these occurrences, each one a quiet reminder that I was not alone. Now, as I sit here writing this, the line between paranoia and reality has all but dissolved. I no longer feel safe stepping outside, my every instinct screaming that somewhere, just out of sight, he might be waiting for me to let my guard down. His presence, at times as subtle as a shadow on a window or as overt as a whispered greeting on a rainy night, has woven itself into the fabric of my daily existence. I'm left questioning not only my own perceptions, but also the possibility that I have become entangled in someone's obsessive plan. Was it all just a series of uncanny coincidences? Or is there truly someone out there deliberately tracking my every move? Even as I write these words, I cannot shake the haunting question. Is this merely my imagination running wild? Or am I being stalked by a stranger whose presence could be anywhere, lurking in the spaces between certainty and dread? I first met him on a sunny afternoon during a layover at the airport. I was waiting near a row of vending machines when a man in a light jacket approached with a warm smile and an easy nod. "Long trip?" he asked, his voice friendly and unassuming. I smiled in reply and admitted I was headed home after a long week of work. His conversation was casual. He asked about my destination, commented on the weather, and even mentioned a few local spots I might enjoy visiting. At that moment, his interest felt genuine and kind. I left the airport feeling unexpectedly cheered by the brief encounter. Over the next few days, though, the memory of that pleasant stranger began to gnaw at me in odd ways. It started with small, unsettling details. On my morning walk through the park, I caught sight of a man who bore a striking resemblance to the airport stranger. He was sitting on a bench, engrossed in a book, yet when our eyes met, he gave a slight, almost secretive smile before returning to his reading. I assumed it was mere coincidence. After all, people do resemble one another. But as the week wore on, similar sightings began to occur. I started noticing him at the grocery store, where he lingered in an aisle, as if he were waiting for someone. The recurrence was disconcerting enough that I began to question whether I was simply being overly paranoid. Then came the moments that truly unsettled me. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned to my apartment to find a single envelope placed neatly on my doorstep. Inside was a handwritten note that read, "I remember what you said at the terminal." I froze. I hadn't mentioned much at the airport, just the usual small talk. How could he possibly know that conversation? My heart pounded, and an inexplicable chill ran down my spine. I tried to dismiss it as a cruel joke, perhaps from someone who had overheard me, but the note's precise wording made my skin crawl. As the encounters continued, The details grew even stranger. At a small cafe I frequented, he appeared again, sitting at a table by the window. When I entered, he looked up from his coffee and nodded, his eyes locking with mine in a way that made me feel both seen and exposed. "I liked our chat at the airport," he said softly, as though recalling an intimate secret. I stuttered a response, insisting that I didn't recall our conversation being so memorable, but he only smiled, a smile that held a hint of something unsettling. Over time, his comments became more personal. He casually mentioned details about my daily routine, how I usually take the 7:15 bus home, or the fact that I prefer a particular brand of coffee. Details I hadn't shared with him, details that he should have no way of knowing. The deeper this strange correspondence went, the more I felt a growing sense of vulnerability. Every time I stepped out the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was there, watching, perhaps even orchestrating these encounters. I began altering my routines, taking different routes, switching up my usual orders, even changing the times I left for work. Yet, no matter how much I tried to evade him, I would spot him in the periphery, a glimpse of a familiar jacket on a stranger in a crowded street, the shadow of his face in a shop window, a nod in passing that made my heart race. I attempted to find a logical explanation. Perhaps he was simply an overly observant person with a talent for remembering details, or maybe a mutual acquaintance had fed him snippets of my life. I even considered the possibility of a case of mistaken identity, a case where I was simply misinterpreting a friendly gesture. But the evidence was too specific to ignore. One evening, while reviewing my daily timeline, I realized that every significant moment, every moment I felt most exposed or vulnerable, had been accompanied by his silent presence. It was as if he was waiting for those moments, as if he was deliberately inserting himself into the narrative of my life. My anxiety escalated into a constant state of alertness. I started to document every encounter, every uncanny remark, and every coincidence that now seemed anything but random. I set up a small camera outside my apartment door, hoping to catch him in the act, yet each review of the footage showed nothing but empty street scenes and strangers passing by. The feeling of being meticulously tracked, of being part of some obsessive plan, became inescapable. I questioned my own sanity. Was I overreacting, letting fear distort simple interactions? Or was there something truly sinister at work? Now, as I sit in the dim light of my living room, the line between coincidence and calculated intent has blurred into something indefinable. Each new day brings with it the nagging possibility that he might appear at any moment, that every friendly nod or casual greeting could conceal a deeper, more controlling purpose. I've searched for rational explanations. Perhaps he's an eccentric with a penchant for coincidences, or a harmless admirer who's taken a misguided interest in my life. But the unsettling precision of his knowledge about me leaves me with more questions than answers. I'm left wondering, is this just a series of bizarre coincidences, or have I inadvertently become the subject of someone's obsessive surveillance? And if so, what does he intend to do next? It began with something insignificant, a lost watch. I remember that day clearly. I was leaving my apartment in the early morning rush when I realized my watch was missing. I retraced my steps along the corridor, checked the small table by the door, even asked the doorman if anyone had turned it in. He merely shook his head, and I chalked it up to my own carelessness. I eventually found the watch lying on the steps outside, its face cracked but still ticking. I assumed it was an odd coincidence, a minor lapse in my routine, nothing more. The following days, little disturbances crept into my life. At first, it was just misplaced keys or a book that wasn't where I remembered leaving it. I even caught myself asking, did I leave the light on? Only to find the lamp already switched off when I returned later. It was all so mundane that I convinced myself my memory was simply failing under stress. But then, things began to deviate from normal. On a rainy afternoon while waiting in line at the local grocery store, I noticed a woman ahead of me laughing at something only she could see. When I glanced around, no one else seemed to share her amusement. Later, as I was checking out, the cashier greeted me as if we were old friends, commenting on a conversation we supposedly had the previous day. I told him I hadn't seen him in weeks, yet he smiled kindly and assured me he remembered every word. The unease began to nestle in my chest, but I tried to rationalize these moments as simple quirks of coincidence, or perhaps my own misinterpretation. Then the strangest occurrences started. I began to notice that when I recounted events later to friends or coworkers, they would act as if our shared memories were not as recent as mine insisted. One evening, I recounted an amusing incident from the day: a misdirected phone call, a stray comment overheard at the bus stop, and my sister responded with a puzzled look, as if the conversation had never happened. I double-checked my phone records and even the security footage from a nearby store, but every detail confirmed that the event had truly occurred. It was as if I were the only one holding on to these moments. Soon, objects around me started disappearing only to reappear in odd locations. A favorite mug that I always kept on my desk would vanish, only to be found later in the refrigerator or even in the hallway. I began keeping a detailed journal, recording every anomaly with the hope that logic would prevail. I reviewed my notes obsessively, trying to connect the dots, but the more I documented, the stranger everything became. The pages would sometimes have entries in handwriting I didn't recognize, as if someone or something was tampering with my records. I started to feel like an unwitting bystander in my own life. On more than one occasion, I caught a glimpse of someone standing in the background of a conversation, a person who looked familiar, yet I had never met. Their presence was brief, vanishing when I turned to confront it, leaving behind a lingering chill. In the mirror, I sometimes saw a flash of movement behind my own reflection, a shadow that wasn't my own. Each incident left me questioning whether I was truly awake or trapped in a waking dream. Then there were the moments that defied simple explanation altogether. One night, I sat alone in my living room when the television turned on by itself, displaying static interspersed with snippets of a conversation that I distinctly remembered having just hours before. I reached for the remote, but the device was unresponsive, as if it had been disabled by an unseen force. At the same time, the sound of footsteps echoed through my apartment, pacing the halls in a steady, deliberate rhythm. When I called out, the only answer was an unsettling silence, broken by the distant hum of the refrigerator and the beating of my own heart. As the days wore on, even my own actions began to feel unmoored. I would set the table for dinner and then later find the plates rearranged, as if someone had meticulously reset everything to a different order. Conversations with friends became disjointed. They would reference events that I swore we had just discussed, only to later insist that nothing of the sort had ever happened. I began to wonder if I was losing my grip on reality, or if something else was rewriting the script of my life when I wasn't looking. Now, as I sit here writing these words, I can't tell if I'm simply suffering from an overactive imagination fueled by stress, or if I've become entangled in something far more insidious, a subtle manipulation of my very existence. Every misplaced object, every altered memory, every inexplicable interaction leaves me questioning what is real and what is a figment of my own mind. I search for logical explanations in an increasingly surreal world, but the more I dig, the less I understand. Am I witnessing a collective erasure of shared moments, or is my own memory betraying me? The answer remains elusive, and I fear that the truth may never be fully revealed.